Welcome, friend. Before we begin, I invite you to gently lower your volume to a soft, comfortable level. Lie back, close your eyes, let the world fade away for now. This is your time to rest, to let go, to simply listen. Tonight, you're about to hear the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series, a quiet journey into the past where nothing is urgent and everything is soft. If you enjoy stories that help you drift off, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay with us. There's a new world waiting each night. And now, let us begin. Life in the Viking longhouses. In the quiet corners of the ancient north, where the wind whispered through pine forests and the sea lapped gently against stony shores, there once stood long, narrow wooden halls known as Viking longhouses. These were not merely homes, but the heart of Norse life, warm, smoky sanctuaries where families, livestock, and stories coexisted under the same grass-covered roof. To understand what life was truly like inside a Viking longhouse, we must set aside our modern notions of comfort and privacy, and instead embrace the simplicity and community-driven spirit of the early medieval world. Longhouses were typically built from timber, oak if it was available, or pine and fir in the more forested inland regions. The walls were insulated with turf and clay to keep out the harsh cold of Scandinavian winters, and the roofs were sloped and thatched, often covered with layers of sod or heather. Inside, there were no rooms in the modern sense. One central hall stretched the entire length of the building, sometimes as long as 30 meters. Along the walls were wooden platforms raised slightly above the ground, used as benches by day and sleeping areas by night. In the very center of the hall, a long, narrow fire pit smoldered, its smoke rising lazily to the rafters, where it would escape through a small hole in the roof, or simply hang in the air, giving the hall a constant haze of wood smoke. This hearth was the heart of the household, where meals were cooked, tools were crafted, and people gathered in the evenings to share songs, myths, and memories passed down through generations. There was no electricity, of course, and windows were small or non-existent. Light came from the fire, or from oil lamps carved from stone or metal, fueled with fish oil or animal fat. The smell of cooking mingled with the scent of damp wool, smoked meat, and unwashed furs. It was not always pleasant, but it was familiar. Life inside the longhouse was communal. A family of 6 to 10 people, along with slaves, called thralls, and occasionally visiting relatives or fellow warriors, all lived under the same roof. Privacy was virtually unheard of, and so too was solitude. In winter, animals like goats, sheep, and even cattle were brought indoors for warmth and protection. Their breathing, the rustling of hay, the clinking of tools, all became part of the nightly lullaby. Daily life followed the rhythm of nature. At dawn, someone would stoke the embers and bring the fire back to life. The women would prepare porridge or bread, made from barley or rye, while the men might head out to tend the fields, repair tools, or prepare for a journey by sea. Children learned early to help, fetching water, tending animals, learning the skills of their elders. Meals were simple but hearty. Stews cooked slowly over the fire, flavored with herbs and whatever meat or fish could be found. Wooden bowls and spoons were passed around, and people ate sitting together on the benches, wrapped in cloaks or sheepskins. At night, the longhouse would quiet down. The fire was banked to keep burning slowly. People would lie down in their shared bedding spaces, often huddled for warmth. Stories would be told of Thor and Odin, of dragons and sea voyages, of the dead returning from distant lands. These were not tales for entertainment alone. They were a part of the culture's memory, a way of teaching courage, loyalty, and fate. The longhouse echoed with voices soft and low, blending with the crackling fire and the distant howling of wolves. Even amid hardship, there was a sense of belonging, of being rooted in something larger. Seasons passed, but the rituals remained. From births to deaths, everything took place within those timber walls. The longhouse was not just a shelter from the cold. It was where children were born, where warriors returned, where elders gave their last breath, surrounded by kin. It was the axis around which Viking life revolved, a place of continuity amid the uncertainties of a harsh and shifting world. As we drift further into this quiet reflection, picture the shadows cast on wood-paneled walls, the glint of firelight in a child's eye, the soft murmur of a lullaby sung in Old Norse, fading into the night. In the longhouse, there was always someone awake, tending the fire or guarding the door, and in that steady presence, others could sleep. And now, you too may rest, carried gently back through time, surrounded by the hush of ancient wood and the comfort of simple things. While the Viking longhouse served as a shelter and symbol of kinship, it was also a living archive of daily routines, seasonal rhythms, and silent understandings. From the moment the morning mist drifted across the open fields, life began to stir quietly within those smoky wooden walls. The sound of a wooden ladle against a clay pot, the rustle of straw being rearranged, the low murmur of someone tending embers, all of it formed the language of the household. There were no clocks, no alarms, only the subtle cues of light and sound to mark the passage of time. Children often rose early, not from obligation, but from the soft stirrings around them, their small hands eager to contribute, whether it meant feeding the goats, fetching firewood, or helping an older sibling mend torn woolens. Tasks were not assigned formally. Instead, one learned by observing, by watching how a mother kneaded dough with patient strength, how a father shaped a wooden bowl using fire and blade, how a grandmother sang to the sheep in soft, repetitive tones that quieted both animal and child. There was a peace to this repetition, a sense that even the smallest actions had meaning. Seasons dictated much of life. In the summer, doors were left open during the day, letting in warm breezes and the occasional buzzing fly. Light poured through the doorway, illuminating floating particles of dust and wood smoke in the still air. The longhouse felt more spacious then, though its walls never changed. In the winter, the world outside grew narrow, consumed by snow and darkness. Then the longhouse became everything: school, sanctuary, workshop, and womb. Inside, furs were piled high, food was rationed carefully, and stories became longer, more vivid, painted with words to stretch the hours. Old warriors recounted distant battles. Women shared tales of gods and forests, of spirits in the hills and omens in the wind. The sound of these stories, spoken in slow, melodic tones, echoed off the low rafters and merged with the crackling of the hearth, creating a lullaby unlike any other. There were no sharp boundaries between generations. Elders lived among children, not apart from them. They were not isolated by age, but revered for memory and wisdom. A boy might sit quietly beside his grandfather, listening as the old man carved runes into bone, speaking softly about ships long gone and friends lost at sea. A girl might learn from her aunt how to twist flax into thread, the rhythm of her fingers passing down knowledge as old as the land itself. Time moved differently then, not by minutes, but by moments, a harvest well stored, a storm weathered together, a child's first successful carving. These were the milestones. In the quiet hours before sleep, after the last tasks were done, families often gathered closer around the hearth. Meals had been eaten, ashes from the fire glowed gently, and the air was thick with the smell of wood, wool, and life. Some might hum a song, others would mend clothes or cradle a child. Silence was not empty. It was full of presence, of warmth, of being together. Dreams, when they came, were not escape but extension, further wandering into the landscape of myth and memory that lived just behind the eyes. And amid it all, the longhouse endured, its beams creaking softly like an old companion exhaling. Outside, wind swept over the thatched roof, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf might call. But inside, all was still. Even the animals had settled, their breathing deep and slow. The rhythm of life in a Viking longhouse was not one of urgency, but of enduring presence. There were no grand declarations, no written records, and yet the essence of who they were, their hopes, their labors, their bonds, was preserved in the wood, the ash, and the stories whispered beside the fire. In this way, each night in the longhouse became part of something timeless, something greater than any one life. As you drift further into rest, imagine the softness of straw beneath you, the faint warmth of fire against your feet, and the sound of voices just low enough to lull you into sleep. Let the longhouse embrace you, as it once embraced generations before, and let the hush of the past carry you gently toward dreams. Beneath the moss-covered rooftops and wooden beams, beyond the fire's glow and the gentle rhythm of breathing bodies, lay another layer of life in the Viking longhouse, one shaped by belief, custom, and the quiet rituals of the everyday. Though the Norse people are often remembered for their raids, ships, and fierce gods, much of their spiritual world unfolded not on distant battlefields, but here, in the muted corners of the home. Inside the longhouse, there was a place not only for family and livestock, but also for reverence, subtle signs of devotion woven into daily life. A small carved figure might sit near the hearth, representing a local spirit or household god. Offerings of bread or mead were occasionally left in wooden bowls as tokens of gratitude or requests for protection. These acts were rarely grand or public. Instead, they were quiet gestures passed down through habit, part of an unspoken understanding that the world was full of unseen forces, and that to live in harmony meant to acknowledge them. The longhouse itself was often considered a sacred space, not only for its shelter, but for its role as a bridge between the human world and the spiritual. Certain beams or thresholds were believed to hold special power, and crossing them might involve a whispered word or a mindful step. Births, deaths, illnesses, and dreams were all interpreted through a lens shaped by both folklore and instinct, with elders often consulted to discern meaning in events that others could not explain. In the darkest nights of winter, when snow fell silently against the outer walls and the wind groaned through the cracks in the timber, these beliefs became more vivid. Shadows cast by the firelight seemed to move with purpose. The creak of wood might be more than just the cold, perhaps the stirrings of ancestors, or a sign that something in the world beyond was listening. These were not fears necessarily, but gentle reminders that life was mysterious and layered. Children grew up surrounded by these stories and symbols. They learned to respect the old trees near the edge of the forest, to avoid disturbing burial mounds, to speak kindly to animals, and to never mock the old tales, even if they didn't fully believe them. There was a humility in this way of living, a sense that humans were not the center of all things, but rather a part of something larger, something woven through with invisible threads. The rhythms of the longhouse mirrored this. Morning brought light and labor, midday was for tasks and teaching. And as dusk settled in, the atmosphere shifted. People spoke more softly, the fire was tended more carefully. If someone had a troubling dream the night before, it might be recounted in hushed tones while herbs were burned to cleanse the space. If a traveler returned with strange news, it was listened to without interruption, for every tale held a possibility of omen, warning, or wonder. Even mundane tasks carried spiritual weight. Spinning wool, for example, was not only a domestic chore, but also a symbolic act, one that linked the spinner to the Norns, the mythical weavers of fate. Stirring a pot, mending a boot, carving a design, all could be done with intention, each motion a thread in the fabric of daily life, strong enough to carry meaning across generations. And in the stillness of night, when all movement ceased and the fire had quieted to glowing embers, people lay wrapped in their cloaks and furs, their thoughts drifting through the veil of sleep into the land of dreams. In that space between waking and dreaming, they might hear a voice not their own, or see a figure long past. And whether they believed it to be a spirit, a memory, or just imagination, they would rise in the morning with a quiet sense of awe. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a vessel for memory, for connection, for the unseen. As you settle deeper into stillness, let yourself imagine not just the warmth of the fire, but the presence of all those who came before. Generations of lives lived in the same narrow space, their joys and sorrows absorbed into the wood, their whispers carried in the smoke. In the hush of this ancient home, sleep is not a departure but a return, to a time when dreams were as real as waking, and the night held space for both silence and story. Beyond the structure of the longhouse and the rhythm of domestic life, another layer of Viking existence quietly pulsed in the background: work and survival. Though their ships carried them across oceans, most Vikings were not raiders or warriors by trade. They were farmers, herders, fishermen, and craftsmen. And much of their life centered around meeting the daily demands of survival in a land shaped by cold winters, brief summers, and unpredictable seas. Inside the longhouse, you would often find tools arranged with care along wooden pegs, simple yet essential objects like bone needles, wooden combs, iron knives, and clay vessels, each made by hand and passed down or traded between families. In the early hours of daylight, tasks would unfold with quiet coordination. Men might sharpen scythes or prepare sleds if snow still blanketed the ground. while women tended the looms, their fingers moving in practiced rhythm across warp and weft. The low creak of the loom beams and the occasional murmur of a counting chant were part of the longhouse's gentle soundtrack. Weaving was not just an economic necessity, but also a matter of pride and identity, as intricate patterns and colors conveyed status, origin, and care. The garments they produced were often dyed with local plants, lichen, woad, and madder, resulting in earthy tones that matched the muted hues of the landscape. Outside, fields needed constant tending. Though the growing season was short, it was precious. Barley and rye were the main crops, hardy enough to grow in poor soil and cool climates. The land was plowed using simple wooden tools, often pulled by oxen or even by hand when necessary. Every seed was valuable, every harvest a gamble against the whims of weather and fate. In coastal regions, fishing became a daily ritual. Men and boys would rise early to mend nets and prepare small boats, while the women smoked or dried the catch back at home. Herring, cod, and even seal were common sources of nourishment, and nothing was wasted. The fish bones were ground for tools, the skins used for shoes or wrappings, the oil burned for light. These practices, honed by generations, created a web of knowledge held not in books, but in memory, gesture, and repetition. Hunting and foraging supplemented what they could grow. Berries, nuts, and wild herbs were gathered when the land offered them, while game such as deer or hare provided rare but welcomed meat. Hunting required patience, often taking place deep in the forests or along high ridges, where tracks were read like runes in the snow. A successful hunt was not only celebrated for its bounty, but also respected for the skill and endurance it demanded. Inside the longhouse, these efforts manifested in modest abundance, hanging bundles of dried herbs, smoked meats tied to the rafters, baskets of preserved fruit nestled in corners. Even in times of scarcity, the longhouse offered a sense of security, a place where resources were pooled and hardships shared. Meals reflected the land's generosity or its limits. A thick stew might simmer for hours, blending root vegetables, grains, and the last scraps of dried meat. Bread was dense and dark, sometimes mixed with seeds or seaweed. Drink came in the form of weak ale or mead, depending on what could be brewed and stored. There were no feasts without reason, no indulgence without cost. But when celebration did occur, after a good harvest, a safe return, a birth, it was felt deeply, echoing in song and shared laughter. Community extended beyond the family. Neighbors helped build homes, mend fences, and bury the dead. News traveled slowly but surely, brought by travelers, traders, and returning kin. The longhouse, though enclosed, was never isolated. It breathed with the rhythm of the village, the seasons, and the sea. And while work never truly ended, it was accepted not with resentment, but with a quiet dignity, a sense of purpose rooted in necessity and continuity. As you rest now, let yourself drift into this world where labor was honest, life was fragile, and every act, from planting a seed to weaving a tunic, held meaning. The sounds of axes in the distance, the hum of a spinning wheel, the call of gulls near the shore, all become part of the dreamscape. Let the warmth of the hearth and the steady beat of the past guide you deeper into sleep, where the burdens of modern life dissolve and only the soft rhythm of survival remains. As twilight returned to the edges of the northern world and the glow from the hearth deepened into orange and gold, the Viking longhouse once again became a sanctuary of stillness. Yet even in these quiet hours, the household continued to hum with subtle rituals of closing the day. Tools were tucked away, hands rinsed with cool water gathered in stone basins, and cloaks were folded beside beds of straw. The air grew denser, not just with the scent of ash and wool, but with the collective exhale of a family settling down. The central fire, no longer roaring, was gently stoked and shaped into a low, glowing cradle of embers, carefully arranged by the one responsible for the fire's safekeeping. This role was not taken lightly. Fire was life, warmth, protection, and food. Losing it meant hardship. A warm hearth was a sacred gift, one that required constant tending, especially during the long, frigid nights of winter. Around this flickering core, families gathered for the final stories of the day. These tales were not always dramatic or filled with gods and monsters. Sometimes they were small, familiar stories. The time someone got lost in the woods and found their way home by following a fox. or how an old cow once gave birth in the middle of a thunderstorm and survived. These were the kinds of stories that lulled children to sleep and reminded adults of the deep, quiet strength in ordinary things. In the flickering light, shadows danced along the curved beams of the roof, weaving soft illusions that stirred the imagination. A child might watch those shifting shapes and wonder if they saw a wolf, or a dragon, or an ancestor passing through the smoke. Dreams began before sleep ever arrived. As the household quieted, sleeping arrangements fell into place naturally. Parents closest to the fire, young ones nestled between them, elders resting farther along the benches, cloaked in thick fur and layers of linen. Occasionally, a dog would curl at someone's feet, its nose twitching in half-sleep, ears alert to the night. In some longhouses, sheep or goats slumbered in their own corner, adding their steady breath to the room's rhythm. And always someone stayed awake a little longer, an elder who needed less sleep, a mother nursing a child, a traveler who could not yet rest. Their silent watchfulness was not intrusive, it was comforting. A soft cough, the stirring of logs, the subtle creak of shifting timber, these small sounds knit the silence together. Outside, wind pressed gently against the turf walls, and the sky above stretched cold and wide, scattered with stars that the Vikings knew well. They had named many of them, charted their paths, read their meanings. Navigation was not only for the sea, it also guided dreams, omens, and decisions. Even the stars seemed part of the household, as much a presence as the tools on the wall or the bundles of herbs hanging to dry. Some nights, if the wind howled too loud or snow began to fall heavily, someone might rise and check the roof or secure the animals more tightly. Then they would return, stamping off the cold, greeted not with fear or urgency, but with sleepy nods and murmured reassurances. There was no need to explain. In the longhouse, everyone understood what had to be done. Trust flowed silently, in gestures more than words. Time moved gently here. There were no clocks to chase, only the seasons, the fire, the body's own need to rest. The hours of darkness were not seen as empty or unproductive, but as sacred. A time for reflection, for stillness, for being. And in this sacred pause, before the next day's tasks began again, the longhouse breathed as one, its people resting like roots beneath snow, quiet but alive. As you lie still now, let this ancient rhythm surround you. Imagine the comforting weight of a wool blanket pulled up to your chest, the sound of breathing around you, the glow of firelight playing across the inside of your eyelids. Let your own breath match the pace of the night, slow, steady, soft. Here in this longhouse of memory and dream, you are safe, you are warm, and you are home. While much of life in the Viking longhouse centered around daily routines, there were moments, both quiet and ceremonial, that marked the passage of time and shaped the inner life of its people. Births, marriages, feasts, and farewells. These were not just events but transitions, each one surrounded by age-old customs, woven gently into the fabric of household life. A birth might take place quietly in the dim corner of the longhouse, surrounded by female relatives and midwives, with the soft murmur of prayer to the goddess Frigg or Air, believed to guard over motherhood and healing. Herbs would be boiled nearby, water warmed, cloth laid out, and incense made from sweetgrass or juniper would gently scent the air. A newborn was not just a child, but a continuation of the line, a new branch on the family tree, and their arrival was met with subdued joy, whispers of names to consider, and promises made over cradles of carved wood and fur. Marriages, too, were marked within the longhouse walls. There were no grand halls or polished altars, only the simplicity of flickering firelight, hand-fasting rituals, and the solemn exchange of gifts. A bride might enter with braided hair, her gown stitched by her kin, a small pouch of sacred earth or a symbolic key tied at her waist. The groom would offer a blade or a brooch, something of meaning and value. Feasting would follow, often humble but heartfelt. Roasted meat, fresh bread, mugs of weak ale passed hand to hand. Laughter would rise gently like smoke toward the beams, and old songs would be sung in a language that held more rhythm than rhyme. Even the youngest would join in, their wide eyes fixed on the faces of those older, learning the songs not by instruction, but through repetition, through warmth, through the quiet sense that this moment mattered. And when death visited, it did not come suddenly or unprepared. The Viking people lived with death as a constant companion, not feared, but respected. When someone passed, their body was washed and wrapped, placed on a board or a bed of furs, sometimes with a favorite tool or a small token for the journey beyond. Stories of the departed would be shared around the fire. Gentle stories, not of loss but of legacy. The fire might be kept burning through the night, so that the soul would not be alone. Outside, if the ground was soft, a burial might be prepared, or in rare cases, a boat set adrift. But within the longhouse, the space left behind was never truly empty. Their presence lingered in the grain of the wood, in the memory of shared meals, in the rhythm of tasks once performed side by side. The longhouse was not only a home for the living, but a silent keeper of those who had come before. Seasonal feasts were another rhythm of life. Yule in the heart of winter, Ostara in spring, midsummer when the days were long and golden. These celebrations were never grand spectacles, but instead quiet acknowledgments of the turning world. Torches were lit, bread was blessed, bones were cast into the fire with small whispered wishes. The air was filled with the smells of cooking, of pine and smoke, of herbs tied into bundles and hung from beams to dry. Each tradition carried meaning. Each gesture held memory. Even silence was part of the celebration, a silence that said, "We have made it through the dark," or "We are beginning again." Children learn not only by being told, but by simply being present. They absorbed the weight of words unspoken, the importance of the way a bowl was passed, the quiet reverence with which the eldest took the first sip. Over time, they would carry these rituals forward, altering them slightly, but keeping the heart the same. The longhouse was a place of continuity, a bridge across generations. As the fire crackled in its stone-lined bed, and the night deepened, the family would draw close, not out of necessity, but instinct. They would listen to one another breathe, feel the comfort of closeness, and trust the world to turn while they rested. The walls, thick with turf and timber, held the cold at bay. And in that hush, just before sleep fully claimed them, there was a moment when everything felt perfectly still. That stillness is yours now. Let it wrap around you like a woolen cloak. Let the echoes of ancient stories, gentle hands, and slow rituals carry you deeper into rest. Here, where the past is soft and the present quiet, the longhouse endures, and in it, so do you. As the seasons turned and years quietly slipped by, the Viking longhouse remained a steady presence, a structure shaped not just by wood and weather, but by memory, repetition, and the soft persistence of daily life. Though the world outside could change with every storm, trade voyage, or rumor brought back from distant shores, within the longhouse, there was a dependable rhythm, slow and circular, that offered a sense of grounding no matter what came. It was a world that changed only slightly with time, and those changes came not in grand gestures, but in the quiet addition of a new tool on the wall, a new name whispered into the family line, a fresh coat of clay pressed between timbers. Life unfolded gently in these spaces. The youngest children, once cradled near the fire, would grow into the roles once filled by others, learning how to shape a blade, gather herbs, mend clothing, or tell a story with just the right pause. Nothing was hurried. No one was expected to know everything all at once. Learning came from watching, listening, and trying again. A girl might sit for hours beside her grandmother, not saying a word, simply spinning wool and soaking in the cadence of her voice, the way her hands moved, the slight shift of her shoulder that meant a thread had caught. A boy might follow his father to the edge of the forest, where trees creaked and snow fell in soft, uneven drifts, not to speak but to understand how silence itself could teach. And so the knowledge of generations passed not through books, but through breath and bone, through the shaping of everyday things. Sometimes the longhouse would welcome guests, traders passing through with stories of far-off lands, neighbors seeking shelter from sudden storms, distant cousins arriving with their own firewood and bread. Hospitality was not optional in Viking culture. To offer warmth, food, and a place to rest was as natural as breathing. A visitor was treated not as a burden, but as part of the fabric of the household, even if only for a night. The benches were rearranged to make space, the stew was stretched with extra herbs, and someone always found an extra fur to share. In exchange, stories were told, of strange animals from the east, ships made of silk and iron, markets with spices that burned the tongue. The children listened with wide eyes, and even the elders leaned in slightly, wondering which parts were true and which were just well-told dreams. These visits broke the pattern of daily life just enough to remind everyone that the world was wide, and yet still they were safe here, in the soft embrace of thick walls and glowing embers. During long winter nights, when daylight barely touched the sky and the air outside grew heavy with frost, people turned even more inward. The longhouse became a cocoon of warmth and shared breath. Wool blankets were wrapped tighter, conversations grew slower, and every movement was made with care. It was a time not of idleness, but of different work: mending, carving, storytelling, preparation. Tools dulled from the harvest were sharpened, boots were patched, salted meat was checked for spoilage, and always there were stories. Each tale carried its own lesson, often hidden beneath layers of humor or sorrow, told in voices that dropped low in reverence or rose in excitement as the fire danced along the speaker's face. Some stories were repeated every year, not because they were forgotten, but because each telling brought something new, a forgotten detail, a different perspective, a fresh laugh. And when the story was done, there would be a pause, a long, comfortable silence where no one needed to speak. That silence was part of the story too. Even sleep was shared. People drifted off at different times, their breathing becoming part of the longhouse's living heartbeat. Sometimes, someone might rise before dawn, unable to sleep, and tend the fire quietly, warming a bowl of broth or pressing their hand gently to the wood beam beside them, as if touching something sacred. The longhouse was never truly asleep. It rested in shifts, like the sea, and within it, life continued, soft, steady, sacred. As you let your own breath slow now, imagine yourself curled under a thick fur, the sound of the hearth still crackling softly, the air thick with the warmth of bodies and the quiet trust of those around you. Outside, the snow falls gently. Inside, all is well. Let the stillness of the longhouse wrap around you and drift into rest. Though the Viking longhouse is long gone from the landscapes of today, its memory remains not in ruins or relics, but in the slow, patient rhythm it once nurtured, a rhythm of lives lived close to the earth, of people bound together by firelight, seasons, and shared breath. In these wooden halls, simplicity was not seen as lack, but as quiet abundance. Each item had its place, each task its purpose, and each person a role that evolved slowly, like the carving of runes into softened wood. The floor beneath one's feet might have been packed dirt, sprinkled with fresh straw to keep it dry and fragrant, while the roof above was layered with sod that bloomed with grass in summer and held thick drifts of snow in winter. The walls, built of timber carefully chosen and seasoned by hand, stood not only as shelter, but as witnesses to everything: the first cries of a newborn, the last sigh of an elder, the hush of prayer offered without words. Within this space, the senses were constantly engaged, not by bright lights or sharp noise, but by subtle changes: the crackle of fire shifting as wood dried, the soft scratch of a comb through hair, the rustling of wool being folded for another cold night. One learned to read these cues not as background, but as language. Time was not measured by hours, but by moments: when the bread was ready to turn, when the cow lowed to be milked, when the air outside changed and a storm was surely near. The longhouse taught patience. There was no rushing the stew as it simmered, or the child as they learned to walk, or the seasons as they turned in their own unhurried cycle. It taught attentiveness too, how to notice the fine crack in a beam before it grew, or the wear in a boot sole before it failed, or the look in someone's eyes before they spoke of their burden. Life inside did not allow for thoughtless speed. Even the act of lighting the morning fire required focus, breath, and care. With no matches or lighters, fire came from ember kept alive overnight, or from flint struck slowly and deliberately, coaxing spark to life like a whisper. Meals were built from scratch: bread from ground grain, stew from dried root and cured meat, butter churned by hand. Yet none of it felt like burden. It was what one did, and had always done, and would continue to do until others took the torch. In the quiet hours between tasks, there was time to simply be. Someone might mend a tunic by the fire, fingers moving in slow loops. Another might carve a design into a comb or spoon, not for utility alone, but for beauty. A child might sit nearby, eyes half closed, not yet asleep, but drifting between the world of wakefulness and dreams. and above them, the rafters stretched out like ribs of an ancient creature, holding the warmth in and the cold out, their beams darkened by decades of smoke and life. There was comfort in this closeness, in this sense that one belonged not only to a family, but to a structure, a rhythm, a story bigger than themselves. Outside, the seasons might bring hardship, failed crops, frozen ground, early darkness, but within the longhouse, there was always a way to endure. The strength came not from wealth or power, but from togetherness, from knowing that someone would share their portion if yours ran short, would tend your tasks if you fell ill, would pass down your story if your voice ever faded. In this way, memory lived not only in minds, but in spaces. The way a certain corner always caught the sun, or how the shadows shifted when the wind blew from the east, or the sound of rain on the sod roof at night, these were the soft details that wove together a life. And now, as you rest, perhaps you can feel that same gentle presence, the kind that comes not from spectacle, but from stillness, the kind that lingers even after the fire has died down, after the last voice has quieted, after the night has fully embraced the world. You are safe here, wrapped not just in imagined wool, but in the soft weight of stories passed down and preserved. Let your breath slow, let your muscles soften, let the longhouse, with its warmth and its wisdom, cradle you into sleep. As the flicker of torchlight gave way to moonlight, and the world outside the longhouse was cloaked in silence, the stillness inside took on a different shape, a kind of living quiet, filled not with absence but with presence. In these deep hours of the night, when the fire had settled into a bed of glowing coals and the air had turned colder, the longhouse did not sleep entirely. It breathed, it shifted, and it remembered. Small creaks in the timber sounded like familiar voices. A gust of wind against the roof echoed like the distant call of a horn. These were not disturbances, but lullabies of the ancient home, sounds that reminded its people they were protected. One could imagine someone stirring in the dark, a mother checking on her child, pulling a blanket higher over tiny shoulders, or an elder rising to drink, their footsteps light, respectful of those still dreaming. In a corner, a dog might lift its head momentarily before settling back down, its breath returning to rhythm. These were sacred hours, not spoken of often, but known deeply. For those who could not sleep, this was a time of thought. With no written words to hold them, memories lived in quiet reflection. A father might sit near the embers, carving a piece of bone slowly, not for need, but to keep his hands busy, while his mind wandered to years past. The laughter of his brother now gone, the scent of his mother's hair as she bent over the stew, the day he first stepped into this longhouse and felt the weight of responsibility settle into his chest. Memory did not need ceremony. It lived in the soft repetition of such moments. Women, too, had their own silent rituals in the dark. A young girl might quietly unravel and rebraid her hair, humming a tune she barely remembered learning, a melody that seemed to come from the beams themselves. An older woman might close her eyes and run her fingers over a woven pattern she knew by touch alone, her thoughts drifting not into worry, but into softness. There was no pressure to sleep quickly, no expectation to awaken at a certain hour. The longhouse allowed space for rest in all its forms: stillness, dreaming, watching, remembering. And when sleep finally came, it was gentle, as if the very walls leaned in to shelter it. Outside, the snow deepened or the rain softened the earth. The stars turned in their great wheel overhead, and the sea whispered to the shore. But none of it could pierce the sanctuary of the longhouse, where lives were lived in layers, of generations, of stories, of shared silence. Even in solitude, one was never alone. The house held echoes of past voices, past joys, past fears, all folded into its wood like the rings of a tree, growing inward and outward at once. Time passed differently here. It was not marked by chimes or bells, but by the shifting light, the smell of the hearth, the feel of wool beneath tired fingers. Children grew without realizing, their measurements marked not by inches, but by how far their voices reached during stories, or how steady their hands had become when braiding cord. Seasons rolled forward, planting, growing, harvesting, resting, and each year brought small changes to the longhouse: a beam replaced, a new pot shaped from clay, a fresh carving added to the post near the door, not signed but recognized by all. These tiny marks of time mattered just as much as battles or voyages. They were the markings of a life fully lived. And so, as you lie here now, in this imagined space where past and present breathe as one, allow your thoughts to loosen. There is nothing you must do, nowhere you must be. Let the warmth of the longhouse settle into your bones. Let the silence fill you, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that holds every soft sound of comfort. The breath of those near you, the hush of the wind outside, the memory of hands that built this place long ago, and the knowing that such hands once reached forward, just as yours do now. Close your eyes, let go, and sleep, surrounded by the quiet strength of the longhouse. As dawn began to stir at the far edge of the sky, casting a faint pale glow that touched the tops of frost-covered trees, the Viking longhouse slowly emerged from its slumber, not with alarm or urgency, but with the quiet unfolding of another day. The breath of those within had long since fallen into rhythm with the breathing of the house itself. And now, as morning crept inward, that rhythm shifted again. A soft rustling of wool, the creak of an elbow easing against a wooden bench, the muffled cough of someone waking, all were signals that the world within was preparing to rise once more. But there was no rush, no chime to break the peace. The fire, which had burned low through the night, was gently coaxed back to life, fed by careful hands with dry kindling and soft breath, the flames stretching upward with gratitude. Light moved across on the walls slowly, falling on objects that had watched over the family while they slept. Wooden spoons, simple cups, a carved figure standing sentinel on the central post. These things were not mere tools, but quiet companions, each one carrying a story. The longhouse, though still, had not forgotten the night. Every sigh, every dream, every whispered word had soaked into the grain of the wood, becoming part of the great silence that lived between its beams. There was something sacred in this transition from night to morning, as if the longhouse itself acknowledged the courage it took to live such a life, slow, deliberate, and deeply rooted. Children stirred, not with complaint, but with the sleep-heavy movements of those who trusted they were safe. A mother drew her child near for one last moment of warmth before the day began. A father stretched his arms and pressed his palm to the ceiling beam as if to greet the house itself. Elders moved more slowly, but with no less grace, their eyes already watching the door, measuring the light, the wind, the weight of the air. Outside, the world was awakening too, icicles dripping in steady rhythm, birds calling low from branches, the distant sound of water breaking free from its nighttime stillness. A new day had arrived, not with fanfare, but with the soft certainty of a promise kept. And as food was prepared, cloaks tied, and plans spoken aloud in low tones, there was a sense of continuity. Today would hold its own labors, its own moments of laughter or silence, of effort or ease. But whatever it held, the longhouse would bear witness to it all, as it had done for countless days before. In a world that so often demands more, faster, louder, the longhouse whispered a different truth. That presence is power, that connection is legacy, that slow living is not lesser, but deeper. The people who called these places home did not think of themselves as remarkable. They rose, they worked, they shared what they had, and yet in the stillness they honored, in the stories they preserved, they built a life that endured not because it was loud, but because it was steady. And now you've walked with them, not as a visitor, but as someone who has felt the heat of their fire, listened to their stories, and rested beneath the same imagined roof. Perhaps as you lie here, listening to the quiet of your own room, there is something of the longhouse with you still, a reminder to breathe slowly, to move gently, to cherish the silence. This story, though softly told, has held the weight of generations, and it will linger long after the final ember fades. Let the last warmth of the fire settle into your chest. Let your thoughts drift like wood smoke toward the ceiling beams, and as you slip fully into sleep, know that you are carried not by fantasy, but by the deep and ancient comfort of a home built for rest, for ritual, and for peace. The Viking longhouse is quiet now, but its spirit endures, in your stillness, in your breath, and in this very moment of surrender. Good night, That brings us to the end of our journey through the Viking Longhouse. Before we drift into our next story, if you've enjoyed this peaceful moment together, I'd be so grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe for more quiet tales each night. And now, let us continue. Our next chapter in the Boring History for Sleep series begins with a quiet look at the role of monks in preserving knowledge. Long before the hum of electricity or the soft tap of keyboards, there were monks, silent figures cloaked in wool, moving quietly through stone halls where the only sound was the turning of parchment and the echo of distant bells. In an age when the world outside was often restless, marked by wars, plagues, and the fall of empires, there existed small pockets of peace, tucked away in monasteries that stood like islands in the sea of time. These were places not of grandeur, but of quiet persistence. Within their walls, a different kind of battle was being fought, not with swords or armies, but with ink, patience, and the slow preservation of thought. The role of monks in preserving knowledge is one often overshadowed by more dramatic chapters in history, but it is no less important, for without their careful hands and sleepless dedication, much of what we know of the ancient world, its philosophies, stories, discoveries, and questions, might have vanished entirely. Imagine the setting, a cold stone scriptorium lit by narrow windows or oil lamps, where a robed monk leans over a wooden desk, copying line after line of Latin text with a quill sharpened by hand. Outside, the wind howls across fields and forests, but inside there is only the soft scratch of ink on parchment. His fingers are stained black, his back aches, but he continues, pausing only to warm his hands or pray. He does not do this for wealth or fame. He does this because the text must survive, because someone must carry it forward, because in a world of uncertainty, the written word is a kind of stability. Most monasteries in medieval Europe had what was called a scriptoria, a special room where manuscripts were copied. Here, monks would spend hours, sometimes days, carefully transcribing works of scripture, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and poetry. They used vellum or parchment made from animal skins, and every word was copied by hand, letter by letter. Errors were few, and when they occurred, they were often corrected with notes or marginal symbols. Some manuscripts were illuminated, adorned with gold leaf, bright pigments, and intricate borders that turned each page into a work of art. But even the plainest copies were treasures. They were proof that ideas could live on through time, protected by the quiet diligence of those who believed in their worth. These monks did not always understand the full meaning of the texts they preserved. A Latin translation of a Greek philosophical treatise, a medical recipe from the Arab world, or a faded poem from a forgotten land might pass through their hands without full comprehension. Yet they copied it anyway, out of duty, reverence, or curiosity. In doing so, they became bridges, carrying forward knowledge that would later be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reignited in future generations. Many of these monasteries were isolated, set deep in valleys or perched on rocky cliffs, far from the shifting politics and conflicts of cities. This isolation was by design. It allowed the monks to live simply, focus on prayer, study, and work. It also meant that when chaos swept through the world, when libraries burned and cities fell, these remote outposts often remained untouched, holding within their walls the seeds of forgotten knowledge. In Ireland, for example, monks in places like Clonmacnoise and Skellig Michael copied not only religious texts, but also preserved fragments of Greek and Roman literature. They became caretakers of classical knowledge in a time when it might have otherwise disappeared. And they did so not with speeches or declarations, but with quiet discipline, day after day, in rooms warmed only by breath and belief. As you lie here now, breathing slowly, you might imagine the glow of an oil lamp on a stone wall, the scent of ink and beeswax, the rustle of wool robes, a world where noise was rare and silence was sacred. In that silence, knowledge endured, not by accident, but by devotion. These monks, long gone, left behind more than just pages. They left us a reminder that even the quietest lives can echo across centuries. And as the candle flickers low in your imagination, you are welcome to rest here, in the stillness of their memory. The quiet world of the medieval monastery was one shaped not only by devotion, but by discipline. Each day was guided by the ringing of bells, not to mark the hours as we know them today, but to divide time into sacred portions, moments for prayer, work, study, and rest. This rhythm, known as the divine office, created a structure that allowed monks to dedicate large portions of their lives to the preservation of knowledge without distraction or haste. Before the sun had risen fully over the fields, the monks would rise from their wooden cots, wrap themselves in their coarse robes, and gather in the chapel for the first prayers of the day. Their chants echoed softly through stone corridors, setting the tone for what lay ahead. Some would tend the gardens or care for animals. Others would bake bread or repair the tools needed for daily life. But a few, often those chosen for their steady hands and sharp eyes, would enter the scriptorium, where the real work of preserving the written word began. The scriptorium was not a place of comfort. Its stone floors were cold, its walls thick and windowless to protect against wind and water. The desks were narrow, angled to support the heavy manuscripts, and the benches often left the spine sore after hours of sitting. Yet for the monks who worked there, the space was sacred. Before beginning their work, they would whisper a quiet prayer, not for glory or speed, but for accuracy and understanding. Their tools were simple: a quill made from goose or swan feather, carefully trimmed and dipped in ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Parchment, made from sheepskin, was expensive and difficult to prepare. Each sheet had to be scraped, stretched, and smoothed to a fine surface. Mistakes were not easily forgiven. A single slip could ruin hours of work. And yet the process was never rushed. Time inside the scriptorium moved differently. A single page might take a full day to complete, especially if it included illuminated letters or delicate drawings. These illuminations were more than decoration. They were acts of reverence, turning the text into something worthy of preservation. Gold leaf was applied with breath and brush. Colored inks were made from ground minerals, flowers, and even crushed insects. Every color held meaning, every symbol told a story, and behind each stroke was the quiet heartbeat of the monk who made it. Some monasteries kept entire teams of scribes, each with their own task. One to rule the lines, one to copy the text, another to illuminate, and yet another to bind the pages. Once a manuscript was complete, it was sewn together by hand, its covers made of wood, wrapped in leather or decorated with metal clasps. These books were not meant to be read casually. They were heavy, valuable, and often chained to the shelves in monastery libraries to prevent loss. But they were there, they existed, and that alone was a triumph. For in many parts of the world, knowledge was being lost. Oral traditions forgotten, scrolls burned in war, languages vanishing into dust. In contrast, these quiet enclaves kept the candle of memory burning. They copied texts in Latin, yes, but also preserved fragments of Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew writings. In some cases, they were the only reason a particular work survived. Monks did not always understand what they copied. Some texts were scientific treatises on medicine or astronomy, written centuries earlier. Others were philosophical dialogues, complex and abstract. Still others were stories, myths, poems, epics. But the monks copied them all, because someone had to, because ideas deserved to live, even if they were not immediately understood. And so, line by line, hour by hour, decade after decade, these silent guardians passed the torch of knowledge forward, not through grand declarations or public lectures, but through quiet, deliberate care. Their legacy lives in the libraries and museums of today, in the pages of books that still bear their marks, in the illuminated letters that glow like stars across the centuries. As you rest now, imagine the sound of quills scratching softly against parchment, the steady breath of monks hunched over ancient words, the smell of ink and old leather. The world outside may be loud, but here, in this imagined scriptorium, it is quiet, still sacred, still. Let that stillness carry you deeper into sleep, where knowledge is not forgotten, but simply waits to be remembered. Beyond the stone walls of the monastery, the world moved at its own restless pace. Kings rose and fell, cities burned and were rebuilt, battles were won and forgotten. But within the monastery's silent halls, time seemed to pause. And in this stillness, the work of preservation continued. Not through force or fortune, but through quiet repetition and humble endurance. The monks who gave their lives to copying texts were not always scholars. Many came from simple beginnings, farmers, shepherds, the sons of craftsmen. They entered monastic life seeking peace, purpose, or perhaps refuge from a world that offered little else. In return, they received shelter, food, and a life shaped by structure and contemplation. Yet over time, they became something more, custodians of memory, guardians of stories they did not write, but honored through their labor. In the hours between prayer and rest, they would gather in the scriptorium or library, not for discussion, but for the long, slow process of transferring knowledge from one generation to the next. There were no shortcuts, no machines, only hands, breath, and unwavering focus. And the silence in which they worked was not empty, but alive, filled with the faint flutter of turning pages, the creak of old wood, the occasional murmured blessing before beginning a new section. Over time, these monasteries became known not just for their spiritual work, but as centers of learning. Travelers came seeking not only religious instruction, but access to the books the monks had so patiently copied. Some monasteries opened small schools where selected pupils were taught to read and write, to understand basic arithmetic or scripture. Though literacy was rare in the wider world, it flourished here in the quiet corners of monastic life. Knowledge was not hoarded, but neither was it spread carelessly. It was passed on with reverence, as something fragile yet enduring. The libraries, though modest by modern standards, were considered vast in their time. Shelves lined with thick volumes, some bound in calfskin, others wrapped in simple cloth, stood like monuments to memory. Each one represented weeks, months, or even years of labor, and each one held within it a piece of the world beyond the monastery walls. Ancient histories, theological debates, herbal remedies, celestial maps, grammar guides, prayers in multiple languages, texts from lands far away, copied faithfully by those who would never see the cities or seas they described. Some monasteries specialized in certain types of knowledge. In Spain and Sicily, where Christian and Muslim worlds met, monks sometimes worked side by side with Jewish and Arab scholars, translating texts across languages and cultures. It was in these places that the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy were preserved, not only copied, but reinterpreted, discussed, built upon. And while the scriptoriums in Northern Europe remained more isolated, their devotion to preservation was no less vital. Even in remote corners of Ireland or the Highlands of Scotland, monks protected texts through storm and raid, hiding books in caves, burying them beneath chapel floors, or fleeing with them strapped beneath their cloaks. They understood the value of what they carried, not in gold, but in wisdom. For while buildings could be burned and kings overthrown, a single idea, carefully written and hidden, could survive and reshape the future. As centuries passed, many of these monasteries faded. Some were destroyed in war, others dissolved in times of reform, but their legacy remained, not only in the books themselves, but in the quiet example they left behind. That knowledge is worth protecting. That silence can be strength. That even the smallest, most humble acts, done with care and purpose, can ripple through time. As you rest now, in the hush of your own room, let your mind drift to those candlelit spaces where monks once labored in patient solitude. Picture the soft glow of flame on parchment, the scent of old ink, the sound of breath and brush in perfect rhythm. Let that image settle gently in your thoughts, and let the quiet courage of their work carry you deeper into sleep. As the centuries unfolded slowly across medieval Europe, the monasteries, those quiet fortresses of stone and silence, remained steady against the passing storms of history. The monks within them were not immune to the changes outside, but they endured them differently. While kingdoms rose and fell, while borders shifted and languages evolved, the monks continued their ancient rhythm: prayer, labor, study, preservation. In this steady pattern, they became more than guardians of scripture. They became bridges between worlds, carrying forward the knowledge of Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and beyond, into a future that had not yet imagined itself. Within their libraries, texts from vastly different cultures rested side by side. Translations of Plato or Cicero, placed alongside herbal manuals, bestiaries, calendars, and copies of scripture in Latin, Greek, and even Old Irish or Arabic, depending on the region. The act of copying was never just repetition. It was an encounter. The monk did not merely transcribe letters. He engaged in a slow, contemplative conversation with the words. Each stroke of the quill, each curve of a letter, was an act of reverence, a quiet acknowledgement that what he preserved mattered not only in his own time, but in the vast continuum of human thought. And yet, despite the holiness of their task, life in the monastery was not free from hardship. Winters were cold, food was often plain and scarce, and health was fragile in a world where medicine remained rudimentary. Monks worked with frozen fingers, by dim candlelight, straining their eyes and their backs to complete a single page. In some scriptoriums, silence was absolute. Only gestures were allowed. A shared glance could convey approval, correction, or request. This enforced quiet was not seen as punishment, but as a path to discipline, a way to ensure that each page copied was not just accurate, but intentional. Outside, messengers arrived with letters or news from distant abbeys. Sometimes, a rare visitor, a traveling scholar, or a displaced noble, would be granted access to the library, where books were chained to wooden lecterns to prevent theft. These visitors would walk slowly along the rows of volumes, running their fingers over spines, reading in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the ghosts of the writers whose words still lived on those pages. Some monasteries even began creating catalogs, early forms of indexing, carefully noting what books they held, where they came from, and who had copied them. In this way, the library itself became not just a room, but a map of intellectual inheritance. Occasionally, the monks added small personal touches to their work, notes written in the margins, drawings of animals or plants, or brief comments on the weather, their health, or their feelings. These marginalia now serve as windows into their world, reminders that these were not just nameless scribes, but individuals with inner lives, quiet humor, and moments of exhaustion. A monk in Wales once wrote, "This parchment is hairy," while another in Germany complained that the ink had frozen in his pot. In these moments, the distant past becomes tenderly human. Even as the world began to awaken from the so-called Dark Ages, and new centers of learning arose in universities and cities, the work of the monks remained foundational. Their copies became the basis for future translations, their illuminated manuscripts prized as treasures of both faith and art. Without their devotion, the Renaissance itself, built on the rediscovery of classical thought, might never have found its roots. It is easy now, in an age of instant information, to forget how fragile knowledge once was. A single candle too close to parchment, a flood, a fire, a war, any of these could erase centuries of thought in a moment. And yet it did not happen, because in cold stone rooms, behind thick wooden doors, monks labored through silence and shadow to ensure that words would endure. As you lie still now, drifting in the gentle dark, know that their work was not in vain. Their hands, though long turned to dust, passed the torch that lights your world today. And in the hush of this moment, as your breath softens and your thoughts settle, you walk silently alongside them, one more keeper of the long, unbroken chain of memory. As the soft light of dawn touched the edges of ancient stone, another day began within the quiet walls of the monastery. Yet it would be much the same as the one before it, and the one before that. A gentle rhythm of prayer, labor, and careful preservation. The monks who moved through these cloistered spaces did not seek novelty or fame. Their purpose was not innovation, but continuity. And it was through that unwavering steadiness that they became unlikely heroes of history. While others looked outward, to the rising empires, the wars, the shifting boundaries of the known world, monks turned inward, focusing not on conquest, but on memory. Their long, slow days were filled with repetition, and it was precisely that repetition which gave their work its power. Inside the scriptorium, the air was often cool and still. Dust hovered in shafts of light that filtered through narrow windows. Rows of desks lined the room, angled for reading and writing, each one worn smooth by years of use. A monk would settle into his place, reach for his tools, his quill knife, his ink horn, his ruler for drawing perfect lines, and then begin, eyes steady, hand patient, heart quiet. Each page began the same way, with reverence. Before a single letter was copied, many monks would pause, offer a silent prayer, and breathe slowly, aligning body and spirit with the task. This was not simply writing, it was witnessing. It was testifying to something greater than oneself. To copy a page was to make a promise that what had been learned would not be lost. Some manuscripts were works of art, Gilded letters, intricate vines curling around borders, depictions of saints and angels rendered with delicate pigments. These illuminated pages are still admired centuries later. But many manuscripts were humble, plain text, black ink, simple covers. And yet, in their quiet simplicity, they carried truths that might have vanished forever. Texts on astronomy, medicine, botany, law, theology, and literature all made their way through the hands of monks who often had no idea how valuable these ideas would become to future generations. They copied because it was their calling, and in doing so, they unknowingly laid the foundation for revolutions of thought. Beyond the scriptorium, life continued with the same deliberate care. Monks tended gardens, grew herbs, baked bread, brewed ale, and cared for the sick. They built and repaired the very buildings they lived in. Their world was small, but it was whole. And within that wholeness, learning found fertile ground. The monastery was not a prison, but a sanctuary. A refuge not just from the chaos of the outside world, but from the forgetfulness that chaos so often brings. Even in times of war or plague, the monastery remained a place where memory was cradled and nurtured. When raiders approached or disease threatened to sweep through the land, monks would sometimes hide their manuscripts, sealing them in wooden chests, burying them beneath chapels, smuggling them to distant abbeys. These acts were not done in fear, but in trust. Trust that someone, someday, would need those words again. And indeed, they did. Centuries later, when Europe stirred from its long slumber and entered an age of rediscovery, it was the monks' work that scholars turned to. Libraries built in universities and royal courts often began with the texts rescued from monasteries. The thinkers of the Renaissance, the architects of science, the reformers of faith, all owed something to the quiet hands that came before. And still, most of those hands remain nameless. Few monks signed their work. They believed the knowledge belonged not to them, but to the world, to God, or to the future. Their humility is humbling still. As you rest now, with the day fading around you and the hush of evening settling like a soft cloak, imagine the glow of a candle beside parchment, the steady breath of someone lost in their work, the sound of ink soaking into vellum. The world is quieter than it seems. History turns more slowly than we think. And in that slowness, in that patience, wisdom endures. Let yourself drift gently into that space. Where time is soft, the past still breathes, and the quiet work of forgotten monks lives on in the silence you now share with them. As centuries wore on, and the world beyond the monastery continued to evolve, with cities growing taller and trade routes reaching farther, the monks within their quiet stone sanctuaries remained deeply committed to their steady, deliberate mission. They were witnesses to a changing world, and though the rhythm of monastic life changed little, the texts they copied began to shift in tone and content. As ideas traveled along rivers and through mountain passes, as knowledge crossed languages and empires, the monks found themselves preserving not only the sacred words of their own faith, but the echoes of distant cultures, philosophies, and discoveries that might have otherwise been lost. In some monasteries, especially those in regions touched by the crossroads of civilization, such as the Iberian Peninsula or southern Italy, monks became translators as well as scribes. Working in dim rooms with the help of scholars from other traditions, they translated Greek philosophy into Latin, copied Arabic treatises on medicine and astronomy, and preserved Hebrew writings that carried the weight of centuries. These acts were not always celebrated at the time. In fact, many monks did this work quietly, even secretly, knowing that it was not political, but essential. Knowledge, in its purest form, was worth protecting, regardless of its origin. To hold a manuscript written in another tongue was not seen as threatening, but as a sacred trust, a recognition that wisdom was not owned, but inherited. The monks who participated in this kind of preservation were not fluent in all the languages they encountered. Instead, they relied on collaboration. A visitor might recite aloud in Arabic while the monk translated into Latin, or two scribes might work side by side, one reading, the other writing, word by word, line by line, often stopping to discuss a phrase or ponder a meaning. These quiet partnerships became the thread that connected east to west, ancient to medieval, and slowly, unknowingly, laid the foundation for a more interconnected world. Not all knowledge came from far away. Some monks also recorded the world around them, observing the stars from monastery gardens, tracking the phases of the moon, writing down medicinal recipes based on local herbs, noting the timing of bird migrations or changes in weather. These notes were often scribbled in the margins or recorded in personal books, but over time, they became valuable collections of empirical knowledge. In this way, monasteries became not only libraries of the past, but laboratories of observation, where spiritual devotion met a deep curiosity about the natural world. Some monks, like the Venerable Bede in Anglo-Saxon England, became scholars in their own right. Bede's writings on history, timekeeping, and scripture were read far beyond the walls of his monastery, and even today, his works are considered among the most important records of early medieval Europe. Others, less well-known, contributed through smaller acts, recording weather patterns, cataloging plants, or preserving stories told by travelers. These quiet voices, woven together, formed a rich and detailed picture of the world as it once was. And yet, the monks asked for no reward. Their joy came not from recognition, but from service, from the belief that to preserve a piece of truth, however small, was to honor the Creator and the creation alike. They found beauty in order, in silence, in repetition. Even their daily routines, washing ink-stained hands, mending a worn robe, lighting the evening lamp, became rituals of care and intention. There was something sacred in the simplicity, something eternal in the slow, careful turning of each page. As the sun set outside the thick stone walls and the last echoes of Gregorian chant faded into the dusk, a monk might sit for a moment longer by the fire, reading over his work, correcting a line, adding a mark of punctuation. Perhaps he paused to whisper a prayer for the unknown reader who might one day hold this book, centuries from now, in a world beyond imagining. That prayer, silent and unseen, lingers still, woven into the pages that have survived, into the quiet spaces between letters, into the rhythm of the breath you take now as sleep begins to draw close. Let yourself rest now, as the monks once did, beneath a high wooden beam, wrapped in a woolen cloak, surrounded by the gentle scent of ink and wax and time. Let the past settle gently over you and know that in this quiet, you are part of something vast and patient and enduring. As centuries slipped quietly into the folds of history, the world began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Trade increased. Roads became more traveled. Cities grew busier and more crowded. The voices of merchants, nobles, and soldiers filled the air beyond monastery walls. Yet within those same stone enclosures, the monks continued their quiet labor, unshaken, unhurried. Their ink-stained hands turned the same pages, their breath fogged the same cold windows. And in rooms lit only by flickering candles and narrow shafts of morning light, they kept copying, translating, preserving. The outside world may have surged forward, but within the monastery, time remained sacredly still. It is in this stillness that their greatest strength lay, for while kings made proclamations and armies marched through muddy roads, it was in the monastery, far from the noise, that the foundation of intellectual memory endured. The monks' focus was never the spectacle of power, but the endurance of truth. They did not choose what was fashionable or politically convenient to preserve. They chose what had survived, what had been passed down, and they guarded it not because it was trending, but because it was meaningful. They understood that knowledge did not need to be loud to be lasting, and so they wrote, quietly, steadily, faithfully. Every manuscript they completed became a whisper passed forward in time. Every copied line was a small defiance against forgetting. Their work was often interrupted by the necessities of daily life. They farmed their own food, they cared for the ill, they mended tools and maintained their chapels. And yet, amid the responsibilities of survival, they found moments, hours carved between sunrise and vespers, to return to their desks, to dip their quills, and to begin again. The materials were simple but carefully prepared, quills trimmed with practiced precision, ink made from boiled bark, soot, and vinegar, parchment smoothed and scored with fine blades. Mistakes were rare, and when they occurred, they were acknowledged humbly, corrected not with shame, but with understanding. These were not perfect men, they were patient men, and patience, in the end, outlasts perfection. Some monasteries gained fame for their libraries. Visitors came from distant regions to view their texts, to study in silence, to request copies. But most of the work remained hidden from the wider world. tucked into dark wooden chests, chained to desks, stored behind thick walls. The monks did not seek renown. They trusted that the words they preserved would one day speak for themselves, and indeed, they did. Many centuries later, when scholars of the Enlightenment opened dusty trunks in forgotten corners of Europe, they found not empty relics, but living voices. The ideas of Plato, the calculations of Ptolemy, the verses of Homer, the letters of Seneca, all waiting patiently, their ink still legible, their meaning still vibrant. These works had passed through the hands of countless monks, most of whom had no idea that their labor would ignite the future. But that is the beauty of their story. They did not need to know. They only needed to trust that the act of preservation was enough. And it was. Even now, fragments of parchment found buried beneath collapsed chapels or behind church walls offer new glimpses into lost works. Each fragment tells its own story, a single phrase, a scribbled note, a diagram, a name. These echoes carry across centuries like footprints in soft earth, delicate but undeniable. They are the proof that someone once cared enough to write something down, and someone else cared enough to keep it safe. As you lie here now, eyes closed, body resting, let yourself drift into that same silence, the silence that once filled those stone scriptoriums. Let the imagined scent of old vellum and ink linger around you. Let the sound of a distant bell ringing softly on the hour remind you of time moving slowly and kindly. The monks are no longer here. Their rooms are empty. Their robes have turned to dust, but their words remain, and their work surrounds you. In every book you read, every idea you explore, every question you dare to ask. In your rest, you join them, not as a monk perhaps, but as a keeper of curiosity, a quiet student of time. Sleep gently now. The long night continues, but knowledge is safe. As the medieval world edged slowly into the early Renaissance, the role of the monastery began to shift, though not all at once and not everywhere. The printing press had not yet reached the quiet hills and remote valleys where many monks continued to labor in silence, unaware that a great transformation was quietly approaching. Even as whispers of change moved through universities and cities, where books would soon be duplicated not by hand but by machine, the monasteries remained anchored in tradition. Within their walls, the ancient practices continued with quiet devotion. The smell of ink and wax still filled the air. The scratch of quill on parchment remained steady, unchanged. There was comfort in this repetition, in the slow, careful motion of letters forming across a page. For the monks, it was not simply about information. It was about beauty, about clarity, about honoring the act of writing as something sacred. The value of a text lay not only in what it said, but in how it was preserved. And so, even as presses in places like Mainz and Venice began to churn out volumes at a speed unthinkable a century earlier, the monks kept working, each line, each letter, a final echo of a world that was beginning to fade. And yet, their role did not become obsolete. In fact, their manuscripts became models. Printers looked to monastic texts for accuracy, for structure, even for aesthetic inspiration. The columns, headings, and ornate capitals that adorned the pages of printed books often mirrored the styles first perfected in monasteries. The patient hands of monks had unknowingly shaped the visual language of the printed word, and beyond that, they had preserved the very text that would now be shared with wider audiences. Philosophies, histories, theologies, and sciences, all made available because someone, long ago, had cared enough to copy them by hand, by candlelight, with quiet breath and unwavering focus. In this way, the monks did not resist progress. They enabled it. They passed the torch forward, even if they did not live to see how brightly it would burn. Their humility in the face of change is perhaps one of their most enduring legacies. Even as books multiplied and literacy spread beyond the walls of the monastery, monks continued to study, to reflect, to record the natural world around them. They kept calendars of the stars and moon. They wrote weather records in the margins of psalters. They described herbs and ailments in careful lists, blending spiritual belief with practical healing. Some became teachers in cathedral schools. Others traveled, carrying books to new libraries, ensuring their safety and accessibility. Their mission had not ended. It had simply evolved. And in small ways, many monasteries adapted. Scriptoria became archives. Libraries expanded their collections. silent study gave way to teaching. Some monks learned to operate presses themselves, binding pages not with a needle, but with clamps and hot metal type. But the essence of their labor remained the same: to honor the past, to protect knowledge, and to prepare it for the future. Even today, in libraries and museums across the world, their work continues to speak. A page written in the 11th century, preserved through war, fire, neglect, and rediscovery, can still be read. The ink may have faded slightly, the parchment may have darkened, but the words remain. Their meaning survives. And with them, the spirit of the one who wrote them, silent, invisible, but present. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel that presence, not as a ghost, but as a memory woven into the rhythm of your breath. The candle is still burning, the page is still turning, and the silence is not empty. It is full of devotion. You are resting in a long tradition, one that values the slow over the sudden, the thoughtful over the loud. Let yourself be carried deeper into that stillness. Let the quiet wisdom of the monks settle around you like a warm cloak. The night stretches long and gentle ahead, and in this moment, you are part of something ancient, something steady, something safe. Even as the tides of history continued to shift, the legacy of the monastic scribes remained intact, quietly embedded in the very foundation of modern learning. Long after the last hand-copied manuscript had given way to printed books, and long after the scriptoriums fell silent, the fruits of their labor lived on in libraries, universities, and even in the margins of the way we think and read today. Their influence is subtle but ever-present, visible in the structure of academic disciplines, in the way we annotate, in how we preserve texts, and in the deep respect we hold for the written word. And yet, for many of these monks, the significance of their work was not about influence. It was about fidelity. They did not ask who would read their copies or what impact they might have. They simply understood that some things were worth keeping, not because they were useful in the moment, but because they represented the best of what humanity had thought, questioned, and dreamed. Every careful stroke of their quill was a small defiance against forgetting, a quiet promise to the future. Their world was not free of hardship. Monasteries were not immune to famine, disease, or violence. Yet even during times of crisis, the work continued. A monk might fall ill, but the manuscript would be finished by another. A fire might damage the scriptorium, but the most precious texts would be rescued, hidden, or rewritten. Their devotion was not just to God, but to the long arc of human memory. In this, there was a sacredness that transcended creed or tradition. It was about continuity, about building a bridge between the past and the yet to come. Some of the most meaningful records we have today are not grand philosophical works, but small, humble notes. A monk writing of a bitter winter, of a famine that claimed many lives, or of a rare celestial event witnessed from the cloister's garden. These observations, tucked into the corners of manuscripts, now serve as important windows into the climate, health, and rhythms of their time. They did not know they were chronicling history. They were simply bearing witness. It is in these quiet acts of noticing that the monks become not only preservers of others' knowledge, but creators of their own. Their careful attention to the everyday turned their work into a kind of grounded wisdom, a wisdom that understood the value of discipline, of detail, of devotion to a task that may never be celebrated, but must still be done. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of legacy, the kind that does not shout, but endures. Even today, scientists and historians turn to these texts. They examine the handwriting, the ink, the corrections in the margins. They reconstruct lost languages, restore forgotten stories, and decode faded calendars. Each discovery is a dialogue across centuries, a conversation between the present and the past, made possible by men who never saw a city, never left their stone walls, but somehow touched the future all the same. And so, as you lie in the quiet of your own room, eyes soft, breath slow, perhaps you can imagine the hush of a monastery at dusk, the flicker of a single lamp, the cool feel of stone underfoot, the warm weight of a robe wrapped tightly against the chill. Imagine the patient sound of pen on parchment, the steady turn of a page, the faint scent of ink and wool and burning wax. Let those images fill your thoughts like a lullaby, slow and low, because the work of remembering is not finished. In your listening, in your resting, in your quiet honoring of their story, you carry it forward. The world outside may be fast, chaotic, uncertain, but here, in this moment, you are part of something ancient and still, something made not of power or pride, but of quiet purpose. Let yourself drift further into that stillness now. Let the weight of time become gentle around your shoulders. You are not alone in your silence. You are surrounded by centuries of care. And the night stretches on, calm and unbroken, eternal. And so we arrive at the final chapter of this quiet journey, a journey not filled with conquest or crowns, but with candlelight, quills, and careful hands that worked in silence. The story of the monks who preserved knowledge is not grand in the way most histories are told. There were no parades or proclamations, no banners waving in the wind. Instead, it was a story written slowly, word by word, across centuries. A story stitched into parchment and bound in leather. A story that never sought attention, but instead asked only to endure. In the solitude of their cloisters, these monks did what many did not think to do. They remembered. When the world outside was loud with war and ambition, they turned inward, creating a haven for thought. When the old empires crumbled and cities forgot the names of their founders, the monks quietly copied those names into books. When languages faded from common speech, they kept those syllables alive, preserved in ink long after the last speaker had passed. They did not know what the future would look like. They did not imagine electricity or airplanes or digital screens glowing in the dark, but they trusted somehow that what they were doing mattered. That one day, someone, perhaps someone like you, might look back and find in their work something steady, something comforting, something worth listening to. In the end, their greatest offering was not the knowledge itself, but the devotion with which they preserved it. Devotion is often invisible, and it is rarely rewarded, but it leaves a trace, a softness in the edges of a page, a faded fingerprint in the corner of a manuscript, a short note in the margin of a weathered text. These marks are the signatures of care, and though the hands that made them are long gone, their intention lingers. There is something deeply human about this act of preservation. It is a form of love, not of one person for another, but of a person for what is true, for what is beautiful, for what deserves to last. That is the quiet power of the monastic legacy. They did not save the world all at once, but they saved a piece of it again and again in every letter they wrote. And in doing so, they made it possible for us to read, to remember, and to reflect. Their lives may seem far away, their routines unimaginable now, but the impulse behind their work is something you might recognize. The desire to hold on to meaning, the need to leave something behind, even if no one is watching. The belief that a whisper, carefully recorded, can outlive a shout. Tonight, as your thoughts soften and your breath deepens, you carry a small part of that legacy with you. Not because you chose it, but because you are human, and to be human is to wonder, to listen, to care. Somewhere in the stillness of your rest, there is a thread connecting you to those who came before. Monks hunched over pages, eyes tired but steady, copying words that would not be read for centuries. You share this moment with them now, across time, across silence, across sleep. Let that thought comfort you. Let it remind you that slowness has value, that quiet matters, that some of the most important work happens without applause. The night is long, but gentle. The past is distant, but close. And you are safe here, in this story, in this breath, in this hush. So rest as they once rested, trust as they once trusted, and drift slowly into the soft embrace of sleep, carrying with you the calm wisdom of those who once lit candles in the dark, not for themselves, but for all of us who would come after. That brings us to the end of our last story. Before we move gently into the next chapter, if this quiet journey has helped you rest or brought you a moment of calm, I'd truly appreciate a like and a subscribe to join us again, night after night. And now, let us continue. Our next story in the Boring History for Sleep series begins with a gentle exploration of the architecture and symbolism of Gothic cathedrals. In the quiet mist of early morning, before the streets awaken and before the bells begin their song, there stands a structure that rises silently into the sky, its stone spires pointing toward something eternal, its delicate arches cradling centuries of breath and prayer. The Gothic cathedral, solemn and soaring, is not merely a building but a story told in stone, a story carved slowly, patiently, over decades or even centuries. Its walls have heard whispered prayers and thunderous hymns, have seen kings crowned and paupers kneeling, have held within them the heat of candlelight and the cool of distant memory. The first time one steps beneath its towering vaults, the effect is not always explainable. The height alone takes the breath away. Light pours in not directly, but colored and softened by stained glass windows that glow like pages of a forgotten manuscript. The columns stretch like trees in a sacred forest, their tops disappearing into pointed arches and ribbed ceilings that seem to defy gravity. But behind this overwhelming sense of beauty and wonder lies a deeper story, one of geometry, labor, devotion, and symbolic meaning that turns stone into scripture. The Gothic style of architecture emerged in 12th century France, evolving from earlier Romanesque forms that were heavier, darker, and more grounded. It was called Opus Frantigenum at the time, the French style, and only later did it acquire the label Gothic, a name originally meant to dismiss its complexity and extravagance. But what seemed excessive to some was, to those who built and prayed within these cathedrals, an expression of heaven reaching earth. Every part of the cathedral was designed not only for function, but for meaning. The pointed arch, one of the defining features of Gothic architecture, was not only stronger than its rounded predecessor, it also symbolized the ascent of the soul. The ribbed vaults and flying buttresses allowed the walls to be thinner, which in turn allowed windows to grow larger, flooding the interior with light, which in itself was a symbol of divine presence. The building became a vessel of faith, a physical embodiment of theology. But more than that, it was also a reflection of the world as the medieval mind understood it. Every stone was measured and placed not just with skill, but with intention. The layout of the cathedral, its long nave, its transept arms forming a cross, its altar oriented to the east where the sun rises, was a kind of sacred map. The floor plan echoed both the human body and the cosmos. The central nave was the spine, the choir the heart, the towers the reaching arms. And when one stood at the center, surrounded by stone and silence, one was no longer simply standing in a building. One was standing in an idea, a vision rendered solid. These cathedrals took decades to build, sometimes centuries. Generations of masons, carvers, and glaziers would pass down their tools and secrets, often never living to see the project completed. And yet they built with care, with patience, with a kind of faith not only in God, but in time itself. They knew their work would outlive them. They knew that long after their names were forgotten, the cathedral would remain, catching the morning light and sheltering those in search of something more. As you rest now, in your own quiet space, imagine the coolness of the stone beneath your feet, the echo of your footsteps in an empty nave, the hush that falls beneath the rose window when the sun begins to set. These cathedrals were made to last, but also to whisper. They speak through shadows and light, through the texture of carved leaves, through the way a single beam of light can fall on a worn pew as if by design. They are not just buildings, they are poems in limestone. Let yourself wander beneath those vaulted ceilings tonight. Let the slow rhythm of centuries lull you into stillness. The stones remember every hand that placed them. And now, so do you. To understand the true essence of a Gothic cathedral, one must look beyond its grandeur and explore the humble origins of its parts. The quiet labor of the stonemason, the thoughtful lines of the architect's design, and the faith of an entire community that brought such immense structures into being, not for personal glory, but for collective devotion. The construction of a cathedral was often the most significant undertaking a town or city would attempt, and it could span not only years, but entire lifetimes. Families worked on these buildings across generations, fathers teaching sons the art of carving tracery into stone, or how to balance the delicate ribs of a vaulted ceiling so that it would hold the heavens aloft. There was no single blueprint that was followed from beginning to end. Instead, plans were adapted over time, as different master builders left their own interpretations and modifications, responding to the evolving tastes, techniques, and theological visions of the era. What emerged was a living structure, part house of worship, part sculpture, part canvas, and entirely sacred. One cannot help but marvel at the ingenuity that went into making these cathedrals feel weightless, despite being built from thousands of tons of stone. The flying buttress, for example, became a hallmark of Gothic design. These external supports extended like graceful arms from the walls, counterbalancing the immense outward thrust created by the vaulted ceilings inside. By transferring that pressure away from the walls, the buttresses allowed the architects to pierce those same walls with large stained glass windows. This was not simply an engineering choice, but a symbolic one. The walls of a cathedral were no longer meant to be solid barriers. They were to be luminous, translucent vessels of color and light. The great rose window, positioned often on the western facade, was not merely a decorative element. It was a vision of the divine, a mandala of sacred geometry through which the light of day would pour into the heart of the church. Each piece of glass was selected and arranged with meaning: deep blues and rich reds, golden yellows and emerald greens, forming biblical scenes, depictions of saints, or allegorical symbols meant to teach and inspire. When the sun shone through them, the interior was transformed into a dreamlike space, alive with shifting color and soft shadow. It was said that the light filtering through those windows was not ordinary light. It was the lux nova, the new light of God, and it filled the cathedral with a presence that was felt more than understood. But beyond the light and the stone, the Gothic cathedral was also a place of sound. Its design created an acoustic environment unlike any other. The height of the ceilings and the shape of the vaults allowed chants to echo gently, for organ notes to rise and linger, for whispers to carry farther than expected. Music in these spaces was not just heard, it moved through the body, surrounding the listener in waves of harmony. Gregorian chants, sung in unison by cloistered monks, would float upward like incense, filling the vast interior with tones that resonated with something both earthly and eternal. To step into such a place was to step into a different kind of time, a time that did not rush, but unfolded slowly, reverently, like a procession through the nave. Every step along the central aisle brought one closer to the altar, closer to the east, to the morning light, to the presence of the divine. And for those who could not read or write, the cathedral itself was a kind of book. The carvings on its doors, the frescoes on its walls, the sequence of its chapels, all were part of a visual language that taught stories from scripture and from the lives of the saints. A pilgrim might trace their hand over the weathered face of a statue, or kneel beside a relic encased in crystal, and find meaning not through words, but through presence. The architecture became a bridge between the human and the holy. And as you lie here now, listening and resting, perhaps you can imagine standing in such a place. The way your breath would slow, your gaze would rise, your thoughts would soften. Let the long shadow of the cathedral stretch gently across your mind. Let the quiet strength of its stones and the soft glow of its windows lull you into stillness. For in the heart of every Gothic cathedral is not only the faith of those who built it, but the peace of those who pause long enough to listen. While the soaring heights and luminous stained glass of Gothic cathedrals often capture the eye and stir the heart, the quiet intricacies woven into their design tell a deeper story, one not of spectacle, but of layered meaning and invisible labor. Beneath the beauty lies precision. Beneath the awe lies intention. Every detail, from the shape of the arches to the placement of the smallest carvings, was guided not just by aesthetics or engineering, but by belief. For those who designed and built these cathedrals, architecture was not separate from theology. It was theology made visible. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, these were not only structural innovations, they were symbols. The upward motion of each element reflected a spiritual ascent, drawing the eye and the soul toward heaven. The geometry of the cathedral, often based on sacred ratios and harmonic proportions, was thought to mirror the order of the cosmos. Builders worked with compass and square not only to measure stone, but to align their work with divine principles. Sacred geometry was more than math. It was a philosophy, a belief that the physical world could reflect higher truths through proportion, symmetry, and light. Even the placement of cathedrals was chosen carefully. Many were built on older holy sites, places long regarded as sacred by earlier cultures. Some aligned with celestial events, the rising sun at the equinox illuminating the altar, or a particular window catching the morning light on the feast day of a saint. In this way, the building itself participated in the rhythm of time, becoming part of the liturgical calendar and the life of the community. And throughout the cathedral, one finds symbols carved discreetly into stone. The lamb, the vine, the fish, the pelican, each one holding meaning, layered over centuries of Christian iconography. Some are familiar, others more obscure. A green man peering from a capitol, leaves curling from his mouth, a remnant of older pagan traditions lingering in this Christian space. The inclusion of such figures speaks to the complex cultural blending that took place during the cathedral's construction. A reminder that these buildings were not created in isolation, but emerged from a tapestry of beliefs, myths, and memories. The facades of cathedrals were often the most elaborately decorated parts of the structure, covered with rows of sculpted saints, angels, kings, and common folk. These stone figures stood watch over the faithful, silent teachers offering moral lessons and sacred narratives to those who could not read. The Last Judgment might be carved above the main entrance. Christ seated at the center, with the blessed on one side and the damned on the other, each figure caught in the moment of divine decision. The message was clear. To enter the cathedral was to enter sacred ground, to step from the temporal world into eternal contemplation. And while the figures on the exterior spoke to the public, the details inside were often more intimate. Carvings on choir stalls, capitals, and misericords, small wooden supports beneath folding seats, revealed glimpses of humor, folklore, and daily life. A monkey playing a lute, a fox in a bishop's robe, a farmer chasing geese. These details, hidden from grand view, suggest that the artisans who built the cathedral also left pieces of themselves within it. Their humor, their imagination, their understanding of the sacred and the human as intertwined. They were not only building for God, but for each other, for their communities, for those who would come after. The cathedral was a gift meant to last, a shelter for the soul, a symbol of hope carved in stone, and so it welcomed everyone, the poor and the noble, the devout and the doubting, the tired and the curious. Within its walls, people found not only worship, but wonder. They lit candles, whispered prayers, walked slowly through the aisles, and listened as voices rose in song. The cathedral did not speak in words, but in space, in height, in harmony, and it invited each visitor to feel small, but not insignificant. As you settle deeper into rest now, imagine sitting quietly on a cool stone bench, your back against a column, the hush of centuries all around you. Above, the ribs of the vault arch overhead, like the branches of a stone forest. Colored light flickers gently on the floor. In this moment, time softens, and you, like all those before you, are simply present, in the stillness, in the beauty, in the breath of the cathedral. As the centuries passed and Gothic cathedrals rose steadily across the landscape of medieval Europe, their stone silhouettes became familiar landmarks not only of architecture, but of identity. Each city or town that built a cathedral poured its pride, its faith, and often its very livelihood into the undertaking. These buildings were not constructed quickly. In many cases, they took 100 years or more to complete, longer than a lifetime, longer than a single generation's memory. And yet the work continued, one carved block at a time, passed from hand to hand, season after season, decade after decade. To participate in the building of a cathedral was to join something far greater than oneself, a collective expression of hope, devotion, and endurance. The process was intricate and intensely human. Masons marked their stones with personal symbols, small carvings tucked into hidden corners, signatures of pride and skill. Master builders adjusted plans mid-construction as styles evolved. Technologies improved, and budgets rose and fell. There were pauses caused by plague, famine, and political unrest, but always the work resumed. Cathedrals became timelines in stone, bearing visible evidence of the years they had endured. One section in early Gothic style with rounded arches, another in flamboyant Gothic with elaborate tracery, a tower added centuries later in the style of a different age entirely. These inconsistencies were never flaws. They were the fingerprints of time. The interior of the cathedral mirrored this journey. Visitors entering the nave often moved slowly, not out of reverence alone, but from instinctive awe. The space was vast, the scale designed to make the individual feel small, yet somehow uplifted. Rows of columns created a rhythm that led the eye forward, while the vaulting above drew it upward. It was said that to look up in a cathedral was to look toward heaven, not metaphorically, but architecturally. The ceilings, with their complex webs of ribs and bosses, felt like the inside of a great celestial canopy. Light filtered through clerestory windows high above, scattering patterns on the stone floor below. In some cathedrals, light was used almost theatrically. Morning mass bathed in gold, evening vespers wrapped in indigo and red. The builders understood not only structure, but atmosphere. They created spaces that responded to time, sunlight shifting with the seasons, bells marking the passing of hours, incense hanging in the still air of winter mornings. The cathedral was a living organism, changing gently each day, quietly echoing the world outside. But it was also a retreat. For those who entered burdened, worried, or lost, the cathedral offered not answers, but sanctuary, a place to sit, to breathe, to think, and perhaps most importantly, to feel part of something enduring. The chapels along the sides of the nave offered smaller, more intimate spaces for reflection. Here, candles flickered in quiet corners, statues stood draped in shadow, and saints gazed out with calm, eternal eyes. People would pause before these altars, offering prayers for the sick, for the dead, for love, for forgiveness, or simply for peace. These were private moments made public through ritual, woven into the daily rhythm of cathedral life. The sound of footsteps on stone, the whisper of robes, the rustle of a page turning in a psalter, all became part of a sacred symphony. And above it all, the towers stood watch. High above the town or city, they rose like sentinels, visible for miles. Sometimes one tower was taller than the other, not by accident, but by design, symbolizing the imperfection of human ambition or the mystery of divine asymmetry. Within those towers were the bells, great bronze voices that marked the passing hours, called the faithful to prayer, and rang in celebration or mourning. The bells did not speak in words, but everyone understood their language. They were the heartbeat of the cathedral, steady and sure, resounding through fog and snow and summer air. As you close your eyes now and settle into stillness, imagine standing beneath one of those ancient towers, feeling the quiet weight of history in the stones around you. Let the slow breath of the building wrap around you like a woolen cloak. Let the gentle echo of the bells drift into your thoughts. You are safe here, in this place made not just of stone, but of patience, intention, and belief. You do not need to move. You do not need to speak. You need only rest, as the cathedral rests, quiet, watchful, and full of memory. As we continue to wander slowly through the quiet majesty of Gothic cathedrals, it becomes clear that these were not only places of worship or architectural feats, but also deeply communal spaces where generations of lives unfolded side by side, layered like the very stones that form the walls. The cathedral was the heartbeat of the medieval town, not distant or unreachable, but central, visible from every direction, and felt in every aspect of daily life. Farmers brought their offerings to be blessed. Merchants paused for prayers before opening their stalls. Children were baptized beneath ancient arches, and elders were farewelled as bells tolled gently through the narrow streets. The cathedral was present in moments of joy, sorrow, union, and solitude. And for those who had little else, no books, no wealth, no home, it offered a kind of permanence, a roof under which the stories of an entire people could be held with care. Those who worked within its walls were more than clergy or officials. They were keepers of rhythm. From the early tolling of the matin bell to the deep resonance of the evening compline, the daily hours of prayer marked time not by clocks, but by devotion. And as the chants echoed through the stone chambers, something of the sacred settled in the hearts of all who heard them. Even those who could not read or understand Latin found meaning in the rise and fall of the melody, in the flickering of candles, in the movement of light across the faces of statues carved centuries before. The cathedral taught without speaking. It comforted without answering. It welcomed without question. And in this silence, the people of the town found something lasting, a steady presence amid the changes and uncertainties of life. Beyond the rituals and rites, the cathedral was also a space for art. Stone and glass, wood and metal, all came together in harmony. The choir stalls were often carved with exquisite detail, showing scenes from scripture, fables, and even humorous glimpses of daily life. Roof bosses, those ornamental knobs placed at the intersections of vaulting, depicted angels, leaves, grotesques, or scenes of creation, each one tucked high above where only the curious or the reverent might notice. Pulpits were decorated with spiraling vines or small symbolic animals, and altar screens rose like lace in stone, separating the sacred from the worldly, while still allowing light and gaze to pass through. Nothing in the cathedral was wasted. Every space had meaning, even if the meaning changed over time. Side chapels might be rededicated, tombs added, relics moved. Yet the overall balance, the sense of cohesion, endured. It was a living structure, responsive and enduring. And at its center, always, was the light, filtered through stained glass, moving slowly across stone, changing with each hour, each season, each year. The builders understood that light was not static. It could teach, could guide, could soften even the hardest surface. And so they gave it room to move. Great windows filled with rose patterns, lancet panels, and biblical stories allowed the sunlight to dance through stories told in color. As the seasons turned and the sun took different paths across the sky, the light would strike different parts of the building, illuminating a statue one day and a forgotten alcove the next. It was as if the cathedral was always revealing itself slowly, inviting those within to see something new each time. And while much of the cathedral's meaning was spiritual, its impact was also emotional. There was something in its weight, its silence, its stillness, that made people feel both small and deeply connected. To sit in its shadow was to remember that others had come before, had prayed, hoped, loved, and feared in the same space. That reminder, subtle but steady, made the cathedral not only a place of ritual, but of memory. And in that memory, there was peace. As you lie still now, with breath soft and steady, imagine yourself in one of the quietest corners of such a cathedral. Perhaps near a side chapel, where a single candle flickers, where dust floats in a beam of soft gold light, where time seems to hold its breath. There is no need to move, no need to speak. The stone does not demand anything of you. It only holds space, for rest, for reflection, for something sacred to unfold gently within. Let the quiet presence of the cathedral surround you. Let its calm steadiness guide you deeper into sleep. You are safe here. The bells are silent now, the candles are low, and the stone remembers, as it always has. As we remain within the sacred stillness of the Gothic cathedral, there is yet more to notice. Details that are often overlooked but were never placed without care. Every sculpture, every arch, every carved doorway was designed not just to impress the eye, but to guide the soul. The grandeur of a Gothic cathedral lies not only in its soaring heights, but in its embrace of mystery, the way it invites contemplation through shadow and symbol. In an age when much of the population could not read, the cathedral became the book, the Bible in stone and glass. Its facades were narratives, its portals were pages, and every curve and figure told a story. The western entrance, where the faithful first approached, often displayed the Last Judgment in layered stone, Christ seated at the center, flanked by angels, saints, and the souls of the saved and the damned. It was a powerful image, not one of fear, but of reckoning, a reminder that each person who passed beneath those arches was part of a larger story. Above and beside them, rows of saints stood like guardians. Each figure had its own gesture, its own expression, often unique and deeply human. The stone seemed to breathe, to listen. On the inside, carved capitals atop columns held scenes from the Old and New Testaments. Some depicted Adam and Eve in the garden, others the flight into Egypt, or the miracles of Christ. Interspersed among them were also strange creatures, griffins, centaurs, dragons, and monsters. Reminders of chaos, of the unknown, of the eternal struggle between good and evil. These symbols were not distractions but essential parts of the cathedral's message. They spoke to the imagination as much as the intellect, acknowledging the mysteries of the world that could not yet be explained. There was an understanding that faith was not always about clarity, but about wonder. Even the labyrinths that were sometimes inlaid into the floors of cathedrals carried meaning. Pilgrims who could not travel to distant holy sites would walk the labyrinth slowly, meditatively, following the winding path as a form of internal pilgrimage. It was a journey without destination, meant to mirror the spiritual path, a turning inward toward the sacred center, and then back out again into the world, changed. The cathedral provided the space for such transformation, not through loud proclamation, but through quiet invitation. In the quietest corners of the cathedral, we often find the chantries and tombs, spaces of memory where the departed were remembered, prayed for, and honored. Here, beneath delicate stone canopies, effigies lie with folded hands, their faces calm, their eyes closed. They are not portrayed in agony or fear, but in peace, as if sleeping beneath the very structure they once helped build or serve. Some are surrounded by angels carved into the stone, lifting the soul upward. Others are flanked by weeping figures, symbols of mourning and devotion. The presence of the dead was not seen as morbid, but as part of the sacred rhythm. Life and death shared the same space, and the cathedral held them both with equal grace. And always, high above, the stained glass windows continued their silent ministry. As the sun moved across the sky, the colors changed. Deep reds softening into purples, blues brightening into green-gold light. Sometimes the windows depicted full scenes, other times they offered fragments. An angel's wing, a saint's face, a symbol like a chalice or a lamb. And in the choir, where the monks or canons would chant the daily offices, the woodwork was often delicately carved. Each stall had its own personality. Animals tucked into the folds, leaves trailing across the backs, figures curled beneath the seats as if sleeping. These were not only decorations. They were stories, prayers, and reminders that beauty itself could be an act of devotion. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was wasted. The cathedral was patient, and it taught patience. It taught that meaning takes time, that light and shadow belong together, that silence can speak more clearly than words, and that sacredness is not found in perfection, but in presence. As you rest now, imagine walking slowly along the side aisle of the cathedral, your hand trailing lightly along cool stone. The sound of your steps is soft, muffled by centuries of worn floor. A distant candle flickers, and somewhere, a breeze stirs a faded tapestry. You are not alone. This place was made for you, as it was made for all who seek peace. Let the calm weight of the cathedral ease your thoughts. Let the quiet wisdom of its walls guide you into sleep, deep and untroubled, under the high, eternal arch of stillness. As the day fades and shadows stretch long across the stone floors of the cathedral, there is a stillness that settles over every arch, every chapel, every window touched by the last light of the setting sun. The grandeur that once glowed with color and song becomes more subdued, the cathedral now wrapped in its evening hush, returning to its ancient silence. In this hour, one begins to feel not just the physical weight of the structure, but the emotional and spiritual gravity it holds. The stones are cool and quiet, but they remember. They hold the breath of every prayer whispered into them, the warmth of every candle lit in hope, the sorrow of every tear shed, beneath their vaulted embrace. And yet they offer no judgment, only a quiet presence that has endured beyond kings and empires, plagues and wars, joy and grief. There is something deeply comforting in this endurance. The idea that long after we are gone, the cathedral will still stand, watching the seasons change, sheltering whoever comes in search of peace. Many cathedrals were built to house relics, physical remnants of saints, martyrs, or sacred events. These relics were often kept in ornate reliquaries, placed beneath altars or inside chapels, where pilgrims would come to kneel, to touch, to weep, or to pray. The relic itself was not always grand, a bone fragment, a lock of hair, a cloth, but what it symbolized was vast. It became a point of contact between the earthly and the divine, a tangible reminder that the sacred could dwell within the smallest of things. The presence of such relics turned the cathedral into a destination, and so pilgrims arrived from faraway villages, walking for days or weeks, following trails marked by ancient trees, crumbling crosses, and the quiet hospitality of monasteries. When they reached the cathedral, weary and dust-covered, they entered not as strangers, but as part of something shared. Their journey was both physical and spiritual, and the cathedral embraced them without question. Even today, the footsteps of those long-ago pilgrims seem to echo faintly in the aisles, a rhythm that never entirely fades. Above the nave, in the upper walkways and galleries, there are spaces rarely seen by visitors. These are the triforium passages, narrow corridors that run above the aisles, behind the clerestory windows. Here, the air is cooler, the light more filtered, and the silence deeper. These were places where caretakers moved unseen, where bells were reached, where lamps were lit. And from these heights, one could look down upon the vastness below. the ordered rows of pews, the great cross at the altar, the glow of stained glass spreading like watercolor across the stone. It is a view that reminds one of perspective, of scale, of humility. The cathedral, after all, was never about individual importance. It was about the whole, the harmony of many parts, the gathering of voices and shared purpose. Outside, in the cloisters, another kind of stillness waited. These enclosed courtyards, often surrounded by covered walkways, were designed for reflection, for study, for breath between duties. A fountain might bubble at the center, hedges and herbs lining the paths. The columns around the walkways bore carvings, some solemn, some whimsical, each a quiet reminder of how even the smallest corners of the cathedral were shaped with care. Monks and canons would walk slowly here, reading psalms, repeating prayers, listening to the wind in the grass. These cloisters were like the cathedral's heart, a place not for spectacle, but for inner quiet. It is here, perhaps more than anywhere, that the soul finds rest. And now, as you rest, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to float gently in the soft darkness behind your eyes, imagine walking alone through such a cloister. The evening is cool, and the air carries the scent of stone and lavender. Your steps make no sound on the worn path. Above you, the stars are just beginning to appear beyond the arched ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell chimes, a low, mellow note that settles over everything like a blessing. You sit on a bench beneath a column carved with vines, and for a moment, nothing else exists but the peace of the present. Let that peace guide you now. Let the quiet of the cathedral hold you. Let the long memory of its walls become a lullaby for your spirit. You are safe. You are home. And the night has only just begun. In the soft stillness of night, when the last candle has burned low and the doors of the cathedral have closed to the outside world, the great Gothic structure seems to exhale into silence, settling into its ancient bones. It is in this hush that the cathedral becomes almost more than architecture, more than stone and glass, wood and metal. It becomes a memory, a vessel for time itself, holding within its vaulted walls the layered breath of centuries. The walls do not speak, yet they remember every voice. They remember the stonemasons who chipped away at limestone blocks by hand, the craftsmen who climbed scaffolding in wind and snow to fit tracery windows high above the ground. They remember the children who giggled through morning mass, the old woman who lit a candle every evening for her son lost at sea, the monks who rose before dawn to sing matins, their voices rising in unison into the cold morning air. Each breath, each footstep, each sigh of devotion has soaked into the pores of the cathedral's walls like rain into earth. And still, the building stands. One of the most enduring features of Gothic cathedrals is their ability to carry multiple meanings at once, to be at once a house of worship, a symbol of a city's wealth and identity, a beacon for travelers, and a silent school of theology for the illiterate. The use of verticality, the strong upward thrust of columns, arches, and towers, was not merely aesthetic. It was theological. The lines that led the eyes upward were meant to lift the heart as well, guiding the viewer towards something greater than themselves. In the dimness of candlelight, the ribs of the ceiling resemble the branching arms of a forest canopy, or perhaps the fingers of heaven reaching downward. The builders believed that beauty itself was a reflection of divine order, and so they built with balance, with symmetry, and with symbolic intent. Numbers mattered. 3 for the Trinity, 7 for divine completeness, 12 for the apostles. The placement of chapels, the number of columns, the length of the nave, all were shaped with meaning. Even the floor plans were sometimes laid out in the shape of a cross, turning the entire building into a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, visible only from above, as if designed not for people, but for God. And yet, despite this grandeur, there was always space for the ordinary. Side altars were built for local saints and patrons. Chapels were donated by merchants or guilds. Names were carved quietly into corners, not to be boasted, but to be remembered. These gestures wove personal stories into the broader tapestry of the cathedral, making it not just a house of God, but a home for the people. Some cathedrals included misericords, small wooden supports hidden beneath the choir stalls that allowed monks to rest slightly during long periods of standing. Even these were carved with astonishing care. Scenes of everyday life, of animals playing instruments, of small acts of kindness or humor tucked beneath the solemnity of prayer. These carvings remind us that faith and laughter, discipline, and humanity could live side by side. The great organs of the cathedral, with pipes stretching toward the ceiling like metallic trees, added another voice to the sacred space. When played, the sound seemed not to emerge from one point, but to flow from the very structure itself. Deep tones rumbled through the stone floor, high notes danced in the air above, and all of it merged into a sound that was less heard and more felt. The organist became invisible, the music itself becoming the presence. And when the music ceased, the silence that followed felt just as holy. As you rest now, allow yourself to imagine lying on one of the wooden pews in the empty cathedral. The air is cool, the scent of wax and old stone lingers around you. Far above, light from the moon filters through a rose window, casting gentle colors onto the floor. You feel small, yes, but not alone. You are part of this story, this memory, this sacred rhythm that continues even in stillness. You do not need to move. You do not need to understand everything. You need only be here. The cathedral holds you as it has held so many others. In the quiet, it speaks not in words, but in peace. Let that peace move through you like the echo of a distant chant, soft and slow, guiding you into deeper sleep, beneath arches that rise like dreams, into a night that stretches like stone toward eternity. As the hours of the night deepen and the world outside the cathedral slips further into sleep, we return once again to the quiet grandeur that surrounds us. The vast interior, once filled with movement and murmurs, is now perfectly still, every column and vault wrapped in shadows, the flicker of a single candle reflecting faintly off the cold stone floor. In this silence, the cathedral does not feel empty. Rather, it feels full of breathless presence, full of stories, full of memory. We may imagine now the invisible thread that connects this place to 1,000 other moments in time. Somewhere centuries ago, a novice monk slowly carried water across this floor before dawn, his feet echoing softly through the nave. Somewhere, a mother gently pressed her fingers to a pillar as she whispered a prayer for her sick child. Somewhere, a sculptor in the gallery above carefully carved the final curl of a saint's hair into stone, never knowing whether his face would ever be seen or his name remembered. These gestures, though small, are woven into the fabric of the cathedral, and the building holds them all in its long, silent memory. High above, hidden in shadow, the flying buttresses that line the exterior offer their quiet support. These massive arms of stone, so essential yet so often unseen, allow the walls to rise taller, the windows to grow wider. They are acts of hidden strength, symbols of support without attention, of grace that expects no recognition. These buttresses made it possible for light to become the soul of the cathedral, for glass to replace stone, for the divine to filter in as color. And in this way, the unseen and the seen work together to form beauty. It is a lesson gently built into every part of the structure. Even the gargoyles, those fantastical creatures perched along the roofline, serve a dual purpose, draining rainwater from the stone and warding off evil spirits. With open mouths and grotesque forms, they are often misunderstood, but in the context of the medieval mind, they served as reminders that the world outside the cathedral was filled with mystery and danger, and that the sacred space within was a refuge. Their strange beauty, twisted and fierce, speaks to the acceptance of paradox, of beauty in the frightening, of safety in the unknown. Within the walls, meanwhile, the altar remains at the heart of the cathedral's design. Raised above the congregation, often bathed in filtered light, it is both center and symbol. Upon it, the sacred rituals of the Mass were performed, the mysteries of faith enacted again and again. But the altar is more than a functional table. It is a bridge, a place where heaven and earth touch, where bread and wine become sacred, where the physical becomes spiritual. Many altars held relics within, small fragments of saints that sanctified the entire building. And above the altar, one often found a baldachin or a crucifix suspended in air, drawing the eyes upward once more, reminding all who gathered there of the deeper meaning within the stone. Around the altar, the choir once gathered in deep rhythm, chanting, reciting psalms, keeping the hours of the day in alignment with the turning of the earth. Their voices, though long gone, still seemed to cling to the air, rising and falling like breath itself. The chants were not meant to entertain or impress. They were offerings, cycles of sound meant to align the heart with something beyond time. The echo of Gregorian tones through stone vaults has a way of bypassing thought and touching something far more ancient within. Even those who do not understand the words feel the resonance. And that is the quiet genius of the Gothic cathedral. It was built not just to be seen, but to be felt. Its scale was meant to humble. Its details were meant to invite wonder. Its silence was meant to calm. The people who entered these doors, peasants, nobles, clergy, travelers, were all offered the same thing, a space in which to listen, to breathe, to remember the sacredness of being. As you lie here, drifting gently into your own kind of stillness, imagine yourself beneath that great vaulted ceiling. The walls stretch high above you, curving like the ribs of a giant ship turned upside down, and you are held safely within its belly. You are not lost. You are not forgotten. You are part of the same story that began long before you and will continue long after. Let the peace of that truth settle around you like a blanket. Let the weight of time become soft upon your shoulders. There is no need to hurry. There is no need to understand. Only to rest here, where the stones remember everything, and the silence has its own gentle voice. Now, as our journey through the quiet majesty of Gothic cathedrals reaches its final chapter, we return once more to the simple truth that these structures were never built for mere admiration. They were created to be lived in, walked through, wept within, and remembered. They were shaped by human hands with aching backs and dirt-covered fingers, men who would never see the roof finished, whose names were never carved into the walls they helped raise. They were imagined by minds who believed that the divine could dwell not only in heaven, but here, in arches and shadows, in silence and song, in flickering candlelight and the soft echo of feet upon stone. Their very incompleteness was part of their essence, for cathedrals took generations to build. A grandson might place stone upon a wall his grandfather began, and a stranger centuries later might sit in a pew beneath that same wall, unaware of the lineage that held it upright. This sense of continuity, of time folding in on itself, is part of the quiet magic they possess. In the great rose windows, we see the world turned into light. Each colored pane, small on its own, becomes part of a vast symmetrical bloom, a circular reflection of divine order. These windows were not only beautiful, they were theological instruments, tools for understanding the invisible. Light passing through them became filtered and sanctified, a metaphor for the way grace might pass through the human soul. As the sun rose, different parts of the cathedral would ignite in color, slowly painting the interior with deep reds, cool blues, golden yellows, and rich purples. Watching this happen in silence, one might feel not awe, but something softer, an invitation to surrender, to belong. Even the floor beneath your feet holds meaning. The labyrinths carved into the stone were not puzzles to be solved, but meditations to be walked slowly. Each step a question, each turn a possibility. In an age where few could travel far, walking the labyrinth became a substitute for pilgrimage, a way of journeying inward rather than outward. A reminder that no matter how winding the path, all roads lead to the center, and from the center, outward again, changed. As you lie here now, wrapped in stillness, think of the thousands who once knelt where you now rest in thought. The child who stared up at the ceiling with wide eyes, the elderly man who rested his hand on the cool wall for support, the woman who lit a candle in mourning but left with peace. All of them are part of the memory held by this place. Just as you are now, you have walked in your own way through these same spaces, through the nave, beneath the vaults, past the choir, along the cloister, and now into the quiet heart where the sacred meets the ordinary. The cathedral has never asked for belief in any specific doctrine. Its doors have remained open to the weary, the curious, the lost, and the faithful alike. It offers no sermon, only space, only stillness, only presence. And perhaps that is enough. As the night deepens and your breath softens, allow yourself to become part of this rhythm. Let the weight of history feel light upon you, like dust dancing in stained glass light. Let the slow song of stone and shadow lull you deeper into rest. You are safe here, within these imagined walls. You are cradled by arches that have stood through storms and centuries, by beauty shaped with reverence, by meaning born from patience. And as your eyes drift closed and your thoughts grow quiet, remember there is peace in the permanence of stone, in the softness of time, in the spaces between sound. Sleep now gently in the embrace of a world built not for speed or spectacle, but for stillness. Sleep beneath invisible stars and imagined ceilings. Sleep within the echo of a choir long gone. Sleep held by the sacred hush of all that endures. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we continue, if this journey helped you rest or brought you a little peace tonight, I'd truly appreciate it if you could give this video a like and subscribe for more calm stories to fall asleep to. And now, let's move gently into the next chapter of our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we begin a quiet exploration of the architecture and symbolism of Gothic cathedrals. In the heart of medieval Europe, where stone met sky and silence met sacred breath, Gothic cathedrals began to rise from the earth like prayers made visible. These were not ordinary buildings. They were visions cast in stone, born from centuries of evolving design, painstaking craftsmanship, and a deep yearning to express the divine through architecture. To walk into one of these cathedrals was to enter a world apart, where light filtered through colored glass like water through jewels, where ceilings soared beyond sight, and where even the smallest detail carried meaning far beyond its form. The very term Gothic was once used disparagingly, coined during the Renaissance to mock what was seen as barbaric or overly ornate. But over time, the word has come to signify not a lack of refinement, but a majestic complexity that speaks directly to the soul. The era of Gothic architecture truly began in the 12th century, in France, at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. There, Abbot Suger believed that light was the physical manifestation of the divine and sought to create a space that would be flooded with radiance. He introduced key innovations, pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses that allowed cathedrals to be built taller, wider, and with more glass than ever before. These weren't mere stylistic choices. They were structural revolutions. The pointed arch distributed weight more efficiently than the round Romanesque arch, allowing for greater height and grace. Ribbed vaults formed a skeleton that carried the load of the stone ceiling, and flying buttresses moved the weight outward, freeing the walls to be filled with stained glass. It was as if the buildings themselves were becoming less earthly, more ethereal, more like the heavens they sought to reflect. Step into a cathedral like Chartres, Amiens, or Notre Dame, and your eyes are immediately drawn upward, not by accident but by design. The verticality of Gothic architecture is not just a physical characteristic, it is a spiritual message. The immense height pulls your gaze and your thoughts skyward. The nave stretches like a canyon of stone, with slender columns rising like trees in a forest, their branches spreading across the ceiling in a canopy of ribs and tracery. The space feels open yet enclosed, sacred yet human. It is awe-inspiring, yet intimate. Every line, every curve is there to guide your senses toward contemplation. The play of light is equally intentional. Stained glass windows were not only decorative, they were didactic and symbolic. Many worshippers in the medieval period could not read, and the windows became their books. Illuminated stories of saints, parables, and miracles rendered in blues and reds that danced across the walls as the sun moved through the sky. The famous rose windows, often placed high on the western facade, are among the most striking elements of Gothic design. These intricate circular windows resemble blooming flowers, but also represent the infinite, the divine, the cosmic order. Their symmetry, their complexity, their light, all point towards something beyond the physical. And yet, it is not just the grandeur that makes these cathedrals meaningful. It is the care given to the smallest details. Carvings hidden beneath choir stalls, whimsical creatures peeking from capitals, angels tucked into corners where few would look. All of these remind us that devotion does not always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes it kneels quietly in shadow, carving one stone after another, day after day, knowing that the whole is greater than the parts. As you listen, imagine yourself walking slowly through the great central aisle of such a cathedral. Your footsteps are muffled by ancient stone. High above, shafts of colored light filter through glass, painting soft shapes on the ground. The air is cool, tinged with the scent of candle wax and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a single voice chants softly, echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. You are not in a hurry. Time moves differently here. This space was built to outlast lifetimes, to weather centuries, to witness history unfold and return to stillness again. Let yourself be carried by that stillness now as we begin our journey through the architecture and symbolism of Gothic cathedrals, where every stone tells a story and every shadow holds a secret worth sleeping beside. As we linger in the hush of the Gothic cathedral's interior, it becomes clear that this space was not designed merely for grandeur, but for meaning layered upon meaning, carefully woven into every stone, curve, and shadow. The architecture itself tells a quiet story, one of aspiration, humility, reverence, and an enduring belief that the divine could be mirrored in human creation. Beyond the pointed arches and soaring vaults, there lies a language of symbols carved into the very fabric of these cathedrals. Let us begin with the nave, the long central aisle that stretches from the entrance to the altar. It serves as both a path and a metaphor. In many cathedrals, the floor plan is shaped like a Latin cross, with the nave forming the body of Christ and the transept forming the arms. To walk down the nave is symbolically to walk toward salvation, to move from the secular world outside the doors to the sacred presence that awaits at the altar. The progression is both physical and spiritual. Along the way, columns rise like sentinels, each one different yet harmonious, guiding the eyes upward. Capitals atop those columns are often adorned with carvings of vines, flowers, creatures both real and imagined, and scenes from Scripture. These were not random decorations. They were sermons in stone, intended to speak to the hearts and minds of worshippers without words. The faithful would trace them with their eyes, absorbing lessons about virtue and vice, heaven and earth, eternity and time. Light, too, plays a sacred role. As sunlight filters through the vast stained glass windows, it does more than illuminate, it transforms. The interior becomes a kaleidoscope of color and movement, as beams of blue and crimson slowly shift across the floor and walls. Light is not static in a Gothic cathedral. It lives and breathes with the day. Morning light may touch the eastern windows near the altar, gently waking the sanctuary with golden warmth. By midday, light floods the nave, dancing along the aisles. At dusk, the western rose window glows with a deep, contemplative hue, as if the building itself is preparing for rest. This choreography of light was no accident. It was designed with precision to mark sacred moments and seasons. The symbolism of numbers also runs deep within these walls. The number 3, representing the Holy Trinity, is seen in triple arches, triple lancet windows, and 3 doors at the cathedral's entrance. The number 12, recalling the 12 apostles, might be found in the pillars that support the choir or the panels of a rose window. 7, the number of perfection and the days of creation, appears in the chapels that surround the apse, or in the sequences of steps leading up to the altar. These numbers were not decorative. They were a form of visual theology, a way to encode belief into stone so that it could be remembered even in silence. And in that silence, the building whispers stories to those who listen closely. Take, for instance, the choir stalls, often crafted in dark wood and etched with astonishing detail. These were the seats of monks or canons who chanted the divine offices throughout the day and night. The stalls often include misericords, small wooden supports beneath the folding seats that allowed monks to rest during long services. These misericords, hidden from casual view, are adorned with playful and sometimes humorous carvings. Animals playing instruments, peasants dancing, dragons curling through foliage. In these hidden corners, the sacred and the human meet, reminding us that joy and devotion are not enemies, but companions on the journey of faith. Even the floor beneath your feet holds symbolic significance. Labyrinths were occasionally carved into the stone, not as mazes to confuse, but as pathways for meditation. To walk a labyrinth slowly, tracing its winding path toward the center, and then outward again, was to walk a symbolic pilgrimage, an inward journey to clarity and peace. For those unable to travel to distant holy sites, the cathedral offered its own sacred pilgrimage in place. As you rest now, picture yourself walking that quiet path. The light has dimmed, the candles flicker gently, the stones beneath your feet are cool and worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Each step you take echoes softly through the nave, mingling with the distant murmur of history. You are not alone. The cathedral holds the breath of thousands, builders, priests, pilgrims, and dreamers, and it welcomes you into its story. Here, in the embrace of shadow and stone, you are invited to let go of thought and simply be. Let the architecture cradle you like the ribs of an ancient vessel, carrying you across time and into a night of calm. As you continue your slow journey through the cathedral, perhaps now your footsteps take you closer to the transept, the arms of the cross-shaped floor plan. Here, the space opens in a new direction, forming a quiet intersection between the long nave and the sacred heart of the choir and altar beyond. The transept is not only an architectural necessity, but a spiritual metaphor, symbolizing the outstretched arms of Christ, embracing the faithful who enter. Light often pours in from rose windows placed at the ends of the north and south transepts, bathing the space in soft radiance that shifts with the time of day and the season of the year. These rose windows are marvels of both design and symbolism. Their radial symmetry draws the eye inward and outward at once, like a meditation on divine order. At the center might be a figure of Christ or Mary, surrounded by rings of saints, apostles, prophets, and angels, all meticulously rendered in colored glass, each segment fitting into the whole like the facets of a living jewel. The artistry here is staggering, and yet for many centuries, the creators of such beauty remained anonymous. Their names were not etched into the stone or signed beneath the glass. Their reward, perhaps, was the knowledge that they had contributed to something that transcended time and self, something meant to bring others closer to peace, to awe, or to sleep. Moving inward, the choir becomes the next sacred threshold. This is the space where monks or clerics would gather to chant the liturgy of the hours, day after day, century after century. The choir is often separated from the nave by an ornate screen or set of carved stalls, creating an intimate enclosure within the grander volume of the cathedral. These choir stalls are works of devotion in themselves. Their canopies rise like miniature spires, their armrests curve into foliage and faces, and their backs are often lined with carvings of parables or fables that offer quiet lessons to those patient enough to look closely. This is the place where time feels most suspended, where the echo of prayer seems to hang in the air like incense. You might imagine, in the stillness, the faint trace of Gregorian chant, voices rising and falling in slow unison, not to impress, but to align the soul with the eternal rhythm of day and night. As we continue toward the sanctuary, we reach the altar, the sacred center of the cathedral, the place where heaven and earth are believed to meet. The altar is more than a table. It is a symbol of offering, sacrifice, and communion. It is often raised upon steps, sometimes sheltered by a baldachin or canopy that lifts the viewer's gaze upward once more, reminding the soul to keep seeking the divine. Behind the altar lies the apse, a semicircular or polygonal end space, often crowned by a ring of radiant windows. This is the dawn-facing heart of the cathedral, catching the first light of morning and returning it in silent splendor. Here, the faithful gather not only for ritual, but for reflection. Many cathedrals included reliquaries within or beneath the altar, sacred remnants of saints or martyrs believed to sanctify the space and connect the earthly church to the heavenly. Just behind the apse lies the ambulatory, a curved passage that allows movement around the sanctuary without disturbing its center. Along its edge, you may find a series of radiating chapels, each dedicated to a different saint, each holding its own quiet altar and flickering candle. These side chapels are spaces of personal devotion, places where individuals would kneel in solitude, while the grand liturgy continued nearby. They offer a balance between the communal and the intimate, the majestic and the personal. Some of these chapels contain frescoes or sculptures, while others are marked by nothing more than worn stone and a soft stillness. As you picture yourself standing in one, perhaps your fingers rest lightly on the edge of a cold pillar, and you hear nothing but the whisper of your own breath. That breath becomes the prayer. That stillness becomes enough. In this way, the cathedral teaches not only through grandeur, but through humility. The overwhelming scale does not crush, it cradles. The endless detail does not distract, it invites. And the quiet does not demand silence, it gently creates it, like a hush before sleep. So now, as you stand near the sanctuary, embraced by shadow and stone, remember that you are not merely visiting a building, you are entering a story, one told through arches and windows, through light and dark, through time and patience. And as you let the story settle into your thoughts, you may find that you are already drifting, slowly and softly, into rest. Beyond the altar, where light and silence mingle in sacred balance, lies an architectural feature often overlooked but rich in both purpose and meaning: the crypt. Hidden beneath the cathedral's grand structure, the crypt serves as a foundational space, both literally and symbolically. It is a chamber of rest, a place of memory, a sanctuary of bones and relics lying beneath the prayerful feet of the living. In some cathedrals, the crypt holds the remains of saints or bishops. In others, it preserves the quiet stones of Prokirkbark, earlier churches upon which the present structure was built. Walking into a crypt feels like stepping backward in time, into the very roots of belief, where simplicity and shadow create an atmosphere of reverence. The air is cooler here, more still. The walls are thick, the arches lower, the carvings more austere. It is in these silent places that the spiritual weight of the cathedral deepens, not in height, but in depth. You begin to understand that Gothic architecture is not simply a reaching toward the heavens, but a grounding in the earth, in history, in humility. As you emerge from the crypt and move once more into the upper levels, perhaps your path leads to one of the side aisles or towers. These areas, while removed from the central axis of the cathedral, are no less carefully designed. In some cathedrals, the towers serve not just as bell towers, but as symbolic beacons, bridges between the earthly and the divine. Their spires point toward the sky like fingers of prayer, their height defying gravity, their narrow stairways spiraling upward like thoughts rising in meditation. Climbing such a tower, one encounters a new experience of space. With each step, the sounds of the world grow faint, replaced by the soft echo of your own breath, the rhythmic beat of your own heart. Light seeps through narrow windows in thin ribbons, guiding your ascent. At the summit, the view opens, a panorama of rooftops and sky, as if the cathedral itself had carried you to the edge of heaven. And yet, even here, there is no noise, no fanfare, only quiet observation, a hush wrapped in stone and air. Descending once more, the focus shifts to the portals, the grand entrances carved with stories, standing open to all who seek rest or meaning or simply a place to pause. The west facade, in particular, is a canvas of theology. Carvings here depict scenes from Scripture, the Last Judgment, the lives of saints, parables rendered in stone so finely that even today, you can see the emotion in a figure's eyes, the texture of a robe, the curve of a wing. These facades were not only beautiful, they were instructive. To those who could not read, they offered stories told in silence, narratives that unfolded with every glance upward. The tympanum, the half-moon space above the doors, was often the most dramatic, filled with angels and demons, trumpets and flames, gates and thrones. But even within these depictions of judgment, there is grace. Christ is often shown not as a distant judge, but as a calm figure, seated, open-handed, surrounded by light. The message is clear: this place, this threshold, is one of welcome. Step inside, and you are stepping into a sacred rhythm that has pulsed for centuries. And yet, perhaps the most powerful symbol of all lies not in the architecture itself, but in the way it transforms those who enter. A child walking into a Gothic cathedral might look up and fall silent, not from fear, but from wonder. An elderly visitor might sit in a quiet chapel and feel time dissolve, replaced by memory and peace. A traveler, weary from life's roads, might find comfort in the cool hush of the nave, beneath a ceiling shaped like an upside-down ship, as if carried by the vessel of the church itself. Each person, no matter their background or belief, brings their own meaning into this space, and in return, the cathedral offers something timeless, something still. This reciprocal exchange between place and person is part of the cathedral's quiet genius. It does not shout, it does not demand. It simply waits, with patience, with grace, with stone carved by hands long gone. And as you rest in thought tonight, letting your own breath become soft, your heartbeat gentle, imagine yourself once more within that sacred space. Imagine the stone beneath your feet, the light through glass above you, the centuries layered like dust on every surface. You are not simply imagining a building, you are entering a mood, a hush, a stillness carried through time. Let that stillness hold you now. Among the most enchanting features of Gothic cathedrals are the flying buttresses, those graceful arms of stone that stretch out from the walls like frozen wings, curving around the structure as though to embrace it. From the outside, they lend the cathedral a distinctive silhouette, a delicate latticework of support that seems both strong and elegant, both functional and poetic. But these external arches are not just ornamental. They are vital components of the cathedral's engineering genius. In earlier Romanesque architecture, thick walls were necessary to bear the immense weight of vaulted ceilings and heavy stone roofs. But as Gothic architects aspired to greater height and larger windows, they needed a way to redistribute the structural load without compromising beauty or space. The flying buttress solved this problem perfectly by channeling the weight of the roof and walls outward and downward into external piers. They allowed the interior walls to be thinner, taller, and pierced with vast expanses of stained glass. Thus, what might have been a limitation became an opportunity for light, for color, for wonder. These stone bridges, with their curved arcs and delicate pinnacles, became emblems of the Gothic spirit, defying gravity, reaching outward, lifting both stone and spirit. They often appear in rows, forming a rhythmic pattern around the apse and choir, each one meticulously angled to support a specific section of wall. Walk slowly beside them, and you might notice how they seem to lean, to stretch, as if whispering between themselves in a silent chorus of balance and grace. Rainwater flows down their carved channels, guided away from the building through gargoyles, those fantastical stone creatures perched at the edges, their mouths open in a permanent cry. To some, gargoyles may seem like odd or even frightening additions, but their presence is as purposeful as any column or vault. They serve as rainspouts, directing water away from the stone walls to prevent erosion. But more than that, they serve a symbolic function, guardians of the sacred, protectors from evil spirits, reminders of the boundary between the sacred space within and the unpredictable world without. Their wild faces, sometimes grotesque, sometimes playful, offer a moment of levity, of contrast, of storytelling in stone. In the Middle Ages, their presence might have been interpreted as both warning and reassurance, a visual lesson carved into the very edges of holiness. As you walk around the exterior of a cathedral, tracing the lines of flying buttresses and examining the varied expressions of the gargoyles, you begin to understand how the architecture extends beyond the building itself. It interacts with this environment, managing rain, wind, gravity, and with the soul, offering lessons in strength and surrender, in function and beauty, in what it means to support and to be supported. Even the roof, hidden from view for many, is a marvel of design. Wooden frameworks, often referred to as the forest of the cathedral, stretch above the vaults like a second skeleton. These beams, sometimes centuries old, hold the weight of the lead or slate roof above. In cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris, the roof structure was a testament to medieval carpentry, crafted from oak trees harvested and shaped by hand, each beam fitted with precision, forming a secret world above the vaults where only workers and time itself ever wandered. Though rarely seen, these upper regions of the cathedral are just as essential as the stained glass and stone carvings below. They represent the hidden labor, the quiet work, the parts of faith and structure that remain unseen but utterly vital. Imagine for a moment standing beneath it all, the arches above you, the beams hidden still higher, the light filtering downward in colored silence. Every piece of the cathedral, from the foundation to the spire, is engaged in a single enduring act, to lift the soul gently upward, toward stillness, toward reflection, toward sleep. And now, as your thoughts drift slowly with the rhythm of this quiet architecture, you may find that your breath has slowed, your shoulders have softened, your mind has quieted. Let the flying buttresses hold you as they hold the walls, steadily, silently. Let the gargoyles stand watch over your rest, and let the secret beams above cradle you like the bones of an old and gentle world. The cathedral, in its patient design, offers this gift without words. Rest now, for all is held. Beyond the walls, beyond the soaring vaults and intricate carvings, beyond even the brilliant stained glass that colors the cathedral's inner world, there is something quieter still, something invisible but present in every inch of the structure. It is the rhythm of time. Gothic cathedrals were not just spaces for worship. They were clocks in stone, instruments that marked the passing hours, seasons, and centuries. From the moment of sunrise, when light began to enter the eastern windows and slowly swept across the nave, To the ringing of the bells that signaled morning prayers, the cathedral was attuned to the movement of the heavens. The bells themselves, hanging high in the towers, were the voice of time. Their sound called the community to gather, to pause, to begin or end a day. Each bell had its own tone, its own weight, and when rung in sequence, they created a kind of music, one that echoed over towns and hills, reaching not only ears, but hearts. Some cathedrals had clocks installed centuries later, elaborate mechanical wonders with gears and figures that danced or struck chimes at the hour. But even without them, the buildings kept time in their own quiet ways. Sunlight moved across the floor with the days passing. Shadows lengthened and softened with the approach of evening. In winter, the light was more blue. In summer, more gold. These subtle changes were part of the cathedral's silent dialogue with nature. Inside, time was also kept by ritual. The monastic hours, the divine office, divided the day into fixed periods of prayer, matins in the dark of early morning, lauds at dawn, prime at first light, terce in mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep. For those living within the cloisters or serving in the choir, these hours shaped the rhythm of daily life. Each return to prayer was both an anchor and a renewal, a way of aligning one's inner life with something greater and more constant than human activity. This rhythmic cycle extended to the seasons. The church year moved through its own calendar of feasts and fasts, of Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, and ordinary time. Each holy day brought a different atmosphere to the cathedral. On feast days, the cathedral might be filled with light, incense, and song. On Good Friday, the altar might be stripped bare, the candles extinguished, the silence deep and unbroken. The building itself seemed to breathe with the emotion of the liturgical year, its stone absorbing joy, sorrow, anticipation, and reflection. Over centuries, this accumulation of spiritual memory made the cathedral not only a structure, but a vessel of human feeling and faith. And within this vessel, art played its silent part. In the corners of chapels and beneath the arches of ambulatories, sculptures whispered stories in stone. A bishop holding a book, a martyr holding a palm, a mother lifting her child. Each figure carved with care, not to dazzle, but to remind. Many cathedrals also served as the resting place for kings, queens, nobles, and saints. Tombs were laid beneath the floor or within elaborate enclosures along the aisles. These were not meant to glorify the dead, but to place them within the eternal flow of prayer. Visitors walking over these stones might read the names and dates of lives long gone and feel, in that moment, a quiet sense of connection, a thread drawn across time. Even the wear on the stone steps, the smoothness of the floor beneath the pews, the faint indentations where knees had rested in prayer, all of it was a record of passage, a diary of devotion etched not in ink, but in presence. The cathedral, then, is not only a monument to faith, but a keeper of time, a holder of stories, a cradle of stillness. And so now, as you rest within this imagined space, carried by breath and thought, you may begin to feel your own rhythm slowing, your own thoughts quieting. There is no need to hurry here. Time moves differently in a place like this. It flows like candlewick, it drifts like dust through a shaft of colored light. It holds you gently, reminding you that rest is not the absence of movement, but the fullness of peace. Let the passing hours fade. Let the weight of centuries surround you like a warm, heavy blanket, and let yourself drift with them. As we move deeper into the quiet heart of the Gothic cathedral, one cannot help but return again and again to the role of light, not only as a physical phenomenon, but as a symbolic force that shapes the entire spiritual and aesthetic experience of the space. Light was not simply allowed into these buildings. It was invited, guided, framed, and transformed. The massive stained glass windows that fill the upper walls were not merely decorative. They were theological instruments, each pane a carefully composed tapestry of color and meaning. These windows were more than artistry. They were revelation in glass. In an age when books were rare and most of the population was illiterate, these windows served as a kind of visual scripture. Scenes from the Bible, depictions of saints, symbolic creatures, angels, virtues, and vices, all were rendered in shimmering hues of blue, red, gold, and green. The glassmakers who crafted these windows were themselves guided by centuries-old techniques, combining sand, potash, metallic oxides, and intense heat to create panels that would hold color for hundreds of years. The richness of the colors was not just a matter of aesthetics. It was meant to evoke the divine, to create an atmosphere in which one could feel the sacred through sight alone. When the sunlight poured through these panels and landed on the stone floor in patches of moving color, it was not only beautiful, it was mystical. The light itself was understood as a manifestation of the divine presence, something that could touch the soul without a word. And so the windows became portals not just for sunlight, but for spiritual reflection. In the quiet hours of morning or late afternoon, one might sit in the nave and simply watch the changing light as it passed through the stories on the glass, turning simple figures into living flames, animating halos and robes and eyes with shifting brilliance. Each moment of light became a moment of meditation. And while the stained glass often takes center stage, it is worth pausing to consider the architectural elements that made such light-filled interiors possible. The clerestory, the upper part of the nave wall, pierced with windows, was a defining innovation of Gothic design. Supported by the flying buttresses outside and the ribbed vaults inside, the clerestory allowed the building to breathe light. These high windows were often accompanied by a triforium, a narrow gallery beneath them, and an arcade of pointed arches below that. Together, these three levels formed a vertical rhythm along the nave that guided the eye ever upward. It was not just a matter of structure, it was choreography, a dance of stone and light and space. The architects understood that the path to spiritual elevation began with visual ascent. Your eyes followed the columns, the arches, the vaults, and in doing so, your thoughts lifted with them. That sense of elevation was carefully measured. The proportions of Gothic cathedrals were not arbitrary, but based on harmonics, ratios believed to reflect the order of the cosmos. Height and width were balanced according to sacred geometry, often rooted in the triangle, the square, the circle, forms that carried symbolic weight. The circle, for instance, was seen as a symbol of eternity, without beginning or end. The triangle pointed toward the divine Trinity. These forms appeared not only in floor plans and elevations, but also in rose windows and rib patterns, in portals and tracery, in the very blueprint of the sacred. This union of form and meaning meant that to walk through a cathedral was not only to move through space, but through an idea rendered so precisely that one could feel it without needing to understand it intellectually. And yet, for all its grandeur and order, there was a warmth in the Gothic cathedral that is often forgotten. Though vast, it was not cold. Though built in stone, it felt alive. The wood of the choir stalls, worn smooth by centuries of hands, the flickering of candlelight against the nave's pillars, the scent of incense curling upward toward unseen rafters. These small human touches grounded the architecture's scale. They made the cathedral not just a monument to God, but a home for the soul, a place where breath could slow, thoughts could soften, and silence could become something sacred. Let yourself dwell in that silence now, wrapped in color and shadow, in rhythm and glow. Let the weight of the stone press out the worries of the day, and let the light lead you inward, toward rest. As the cathedral continued to evolve during the height of the Gothic period, attention turned not only to the structure itself, but also to the immense portals and doorways that formed the grand entrance into the sacred space. These portals, far from being mere thresholds, were deeply symbolic zones, places of transition between the temporal and the eternal, the ordinary and the divine. Approaching a cathedral's main entrance, one would often be greeted by an elaborate tympanum, the semicircular or pointed arch above the doorway, filled with high-relief sculptures that depicted complex biblical scenes from the Last Judgment to the coronation of the Virgin to the lives of saints. These carvings were not simply ornamental. They were intended to teach, to awe, and to prepare the soul. The faithful, upon arriving at the cathedral steps, would pause not only out of reverence, but because the very facade demanded contemplation. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of figures might fill the stone canvas. Angels, apostles, demons, animals, and symbolic shapes, each one chiseled with intention, each one part of a larger story meant to stir reflection before entry. To the medieval mind, these stories were living truths. They were not metaphor, but memory, not art, but revelation. Stepping under them was a sacred act. The doors themselves were often made of heavy wood bound in iron, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of hands and weather. Above and around them, archivolts, nested arches filled with figures and patterns, created a sense of expansion, as if the very architecture was drawing one inward. And flanking the portals were statues of kings and prophets, of saints and martyrs, standing as silent witnesses to the passage of time. In cathedrals like Reims, Amiens, and Chartres, these sculptures possess a curious vitality. Though made of stone, they seem almost to breathe. Their robes flow with natural folds, their faces bear emotion, their stances convey quiet strength. This movement toward realism in sculpture marked a profound shift in medieval thought, a growing attention to the human experience, to the body as a vessel of spirit, to emotion as a path to the divine. Once inside, the grandeur of the portal gave way to the hush of the nave, a vast and open interior framed by rows of columns and arches that seemed to stretch on forever. The nave, derived from the Latin word navis, meaning ship, was seen as a vessel carrying the faithful through the storm of life. The ceiling above, with its ribbed vaults and pointed arches, resembled an inverted hull, emphasizing the sense of shelter and journey. Walking down the central aisle, light would filter through the stained glass windows, not all at once, but in shifting patches, changing with the hours, the weather, the seasons. It was never the same space twice. The transept, intersecting the nave like a cross, gave the cathedral its cruciform shape, reinforcing the theological symbolism embedded into the very plan of the building. From above, the cathedral resembled the body of Christ laid upon the earth, head in the apse, arms in the transept, heart at the crossing. Each part of the building thus became more than architectural, it became spiritual anatomy. The choir, where the clergy sat and the daily offices were sung, was often enclosed with ornate wooden screens, intricately carved with vines, figures, and patterns. The stalls themselves bore misericords, small hidden supports beneath the folding seats, that were often adorned with whimsical or moral scenes. A fox in monk's robes, a knight battling a snail, a farmer chasing a goose. These small carvings offered a touch of humor, a glimpse of everyday life amidst the grandeur, reminding all who entered that holiness did not exclude humanity. And beyond the choir lay the apse and the high altar, the focal point of the cathedral, bathed in light and crowned with gold, where incense rose and bells rang and the mystery of the Eucharist unfolded. Every step toward the altar was a movement deeper into the sacred, a journey from the world's edge into the heart of the divine. Let yourself walk slowly along this path now. Let your breath match your footsteps. Let your mind soften as the great doors close behind you and the cool hush of stone wraps around you. You are safe here. You are held by arches and prayers, by sculpture and silence. Let the journey continue within. As we linger within the stillness of the cathedral's heart, it is worth turning our gaze upward once more, not merely to admire the soaring vaults or stained glass windows, but to consider the remarkable engineering that made such heights possible. The Gothic cathedral was not born of whimsy or fantasy, but of precise calculation, evolving innovation, and a deep understanding of forces seen and unseen. One of the most iconic features of this architectural revolution was the flying buttress, a graceful external support that seemed almost to defy its purpose by appearing light and decorative, even as it bore the immense lateral thrust of the building's towering walls and roof. Before the Gothic period, massive walls were required to hold up a stone ceiling, but the introduction of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed for thinner walls and larger windows, permitting light to flood the interior while still maintaining structural integrity. These elements worked in harmony, like the parts of a living organism. The pointed arch, more stable than the rounded arch, redirected weight downwards more efficiently. The ribbed vaults distributed the load across multiple points, and the flying buttresses transferred the pressure outwards to the piers, standing proudly like sentinels outside. This marriage of beauty and function allowed cathedrals to reach unprecedented heights, both physically and spiritually. Consider the nave of Beauvais Cathedral, reaching over 150 feet into the air, an ambitious height that eventually led to partial collapse and decades of structural reinforcement. Or the great rose window of Notre Dame de Paris, held in place by a delicate balance of stone and lead, still managing to glow with ancient light centuries after its creation. These feats were not mere arrogance, they were acts of faith in matter and mathematics, testaments to the conviction that the divine could be mirrored through design. But the builders themselves, often anonymous, often poor, left their own subtle marks. Hidden on the underside of stones or tucked beneath capitals, masons would sometimes carve small symbols, faces, initials, or tools, quiet signatures embedded in the bones of the cathedral. These marks, called masons' marks, served both as records of labor and as a way to be paid for work done. Though the architects and bishops may have envisioned the structure, it was thousands of hands that shaped it, lifting stone, mixing mortar, climbing scaffolds day after day, year after year. Many workers spent their entire lives building a cathedral they would never see completed. Some started as apprentices and died as masters, their legacy sealed into the arches and vaults above. For them, it was more than work. It was vocation. Even the tools they used, chisels, hammers, compasses, were treated with respect, handed down across generations. The masons often worked according to sacred geometry, measuring not only with rulers, but with proportion and intuition. Their knowledge was encoded into guild traditions, kept secret, passed on like liturgy. The construction process itself unfolded slowly, sometimes over centuries. At Chartres, for example, a fire in 1194 destroyed much of the earlier church, but the reconstruction that followed became one of the finest examples of High Gothic design. The people of the city, nobles and peasants alike, contributed time, materials, and labor. It is said that villagers carried stones on their backs from miles away, singing hymns as they walked. This collective effort turned the cathedral into more than a building. It became the soul of a community, an embodiment of shared hope and devotion. And even now, as centuries pass and scaffolding returns for restoration, these ancient stones continue to hold stories. Stories of labor and longing, of vision and patience. Stories of men who worked by candlelight, chiseling patterns into stone as the wind howled outside. Stories of rain-soaked roofs and dusty crypts, of sacred chants echoing through empty aisles. The cathedral remembers it all. And so do we, as we sit in the silence it offers. Let the quiet endurance of stone settle around you now. Let the weight of centuries rest softly on your shoulders. There is no rush, there is no task, only breath and stillness and the comforting knowledge that beauty can rise slowly, one stone at a time, in the dark. As our journey through the hushed corridors and soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals draws gently to a close, we find ourselves no longer merely observers, but participants in a legacy that spans centuries. These great buildings, once rising stone by stone, under the calloused hands of masons and the solemn prayers of monks, remain not only as architectural triumphs, but as living monuments to human devotion, imagination, and resilience. Gothic cathedrals were never static. They changed with time, responded to damage, were rebuilt after fire or war, adjusted as tastes and doctrines shifted, and endured as symbols of continuity in a world always in motion. Over the centuries, cathedrals witnessed coronations and funerals, revolutions and restorations, the rise of empires and the quiet persistence of faith. Even when stripped of relics or scarred by time, their spirit remained intact. The stone carried memory, the silence carried meaning, the shadows remembered. Some Gothic cathedrals, like Notre Dame, became global icons, while others remained tucked in quiet towns, visited only by the wind and those few who still sought their peace. But whether famed or forgotten, each one shared the same sacred DNA, the same upward pull, the same reverence for light, the same deep roots in soil and story. As we reflect on their meaning, it is clear that Gothic cathedrals were more than houses of worship. They were instruments for the soul. They taught through beauty, they consoled through space. They elevated the common man by allowing anyone, regardless of wealth, rank, or education, to stand in awe, to feel small in the best possible way, to experience the quiet dignity of belonging to something greater than oneself. That is the true magic of these cathedrals, not just their scale or artistry or endurance, but their ability to hold people in silence, to invite contemplation in an increasingly noisy world. Even now, centuries later, as tourists shuffle through their naves and flashbulbs catch the glint of ancient glass, the heart of these spaces remains intact. If you pause long enough, you can still hear the soft echo of Gregorian chants, still feel the warmth of candlelight on worn stone, still sense the hands that carved each curve and figure, not hurried, not distracted, but steady and sure. There's a rhythm to that kind of work, a sacred patience that the modern world often forgets. And perhaps that is why we return to these places, again and again, even if only in thought or dream. Because they remind us of stillness, of intention, of enduring grace. As you lie here now, in quiet, letting sleep gently approach, imagine one final image, a single shaft of colored light falling through a high stained glass window, landing on the stone floor of an empty cathedral. Dust floats lazily in the beam, untouched. Outside, the wind carries the faint sound of a bell. The space is vast, but you are not lost in it. You are held. You are welcome. The cathedral does not rush you, does not ask anything of you. It simply offers its silence, its beauty, its enduring strength. And you may rest here, in the calm of 1,000 years, breathing softly beneath the weightless arches of memory. Let your thoughts fade now, like footsteps on old stone. Let your breath rise and fall like the cathedral's quiet breath. This is the end of the journey, but not the end of wonder. In this stillness, the story remains. And now, you may sleep. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we begin our next quiet journey, I kindly ask you to give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these sleepy tales flowing. Now, let us continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we drift into the forgotten world of the lost cities of the Amazon Basin. Far away from the bustling cities and modern highways, deep within the thick green curtain of the Amazon rainforest, lies a world that whispers of forgotten grandeur and ancient mystery. The Amazon Basin, with its vast riverways, humid air, and towering canopies, is often seen today as a wild, untamed frontier, untouched by time. But this was not always the case. Long before European explorers set foot on these lands, the basin was home to thriving civilizations, intricate networks of trade, and possibly even vast cities built of earth, wood, and stone. It's easy to think of the rainforest as a place too wild, too hostile for large societies to flourish. But archaeology has slowly, gently rewritten that belief. In the last few decades, satellite imagery, ground surveys, and LiDAR technology, tools that peel back the dense vegetation without disturbing the earth, have begun to reveal faint geometric shapes hidden beneath the canopy: circles, squares, raised causeways, buried mounds, and remnants of what may have been entire urban complexes. These discoveries suggest that the Amazon, rather than being a pristine wilderness, was once a human-shaped landscape. Let's journey back quietly now to a time before the arrival of Europeans, perhaps 1,000 years ago, when the forest was not a barrier, but a home, cultivated and cared for by its inhabitants. The peoples of the Amazon did not build in stone like the Maya or the Inca. Their cities, if we may call them that, were made from earthworks, great ditches and embankments that formed ceremonial spaces, defensive walls, and settlement layouts. These structures, though humble in material, were massive in scope and often geometrically precise. Along the upper Jingu River, researchers have uncovered evidence of a sophisticated society made up of dozens of villages connected by wide, straight roads, some running for miles through the forest. These villages were organized in a grid-like pattern, with central plazas, moats, and causeways that suggest careful planning and cultural complexity. The people practiced what some scholars call Amazonian dark earth agriculture, transforming the poor rainforest soil into rich, fertile ground using charcoal, compost, and organic waste. This terra preta, as it is known in Portuguese, remains incredibly productive even centuries later and is considered one of the most enduring legacies of pre-Columbian Amazonian ingenuity. The existence of terra preta challenges the old assumption that the rainforest could not support large populations. On the contrary, it appears that the people living here not only adapted to the forest, they reshaped it. The forest we see today may in fact be, in part, a garden, an ancient living mosaic of cultivated trees, palms, and plants that were selected, protected, and propagated by generations long past. But what happened to these people? to these possible cities that once pulsed with life beneath the trees. Much remains unknown. It is believed that waves of disease, introduced by early European contact, swept across the basin before settlers ever arrived in large numbers, decimating populations and leaving once thriving societies vulnerable and dispersed. Without people to maintain them, the forest slowly reclaimed roads and plazas, swallowed ditches and embankments, and softened all human traces with leaf and root. For centuries, the idea of civilization in the Amazon was dismissed as myth, as fantasy, as the fever dream of overeager conquistadors like Francisco de Orellana, who in the 1540s claimed to have seen vast settlements along the Amazon River. His reports were ridiculed, his name nearly forgotten, and yet today, we are beginning to wonder if he saw more truth than we once believed. As you rest here tonight, let your thoughts drift to a quiet place where nature and civilization once intertwined. Imagine a village lit by firelight, with laughter echoing beneath the stars and the rustle of trees carrying songs older than memory. No stone monuments remain, no towering ruins break the canopy, and yet the story endures, buried just beneath the soil, waiting to be heard once more. As we venture deeper into the dense tapestry of the Amazon basin, we begin to uncover not just the physical remnants of ancient lives, but also the subtle philosophies that may have shaped those vanished societies. To live in the rainforest was not simply a matter of survival. It was an art, a dialogue with the environment, a rhythm understood only by those who listened carefully to the world around them. The people who once populated the Amazon did not carve empires into stone, nor did they leave behind towering ziggurats or sweeping colonnades. Instead, they left patterns in the earth, invisible from the forest floor, but unmistakable when viewed from above. These patterns, geoglyphs, reveal shapes of squares, circles, and complex geometric designs, sometimes spanning hundreds of meters. First spotted in deforested fields in western Brazil, these geoglyphs puzzled researchers for years. Were they ceremonial, defensive, astronomical? No one knows for sure. Some date back more than 2,000 years, suggesting that the Amazon's history of structured human activity may be far older than what once assumed. What's remarkable is that many of these geoglyphs appear in places that are now entirely forested, indicating that the trees we assume have always been there may, in fact, be relatively recent regrowth. This challenges the romantic idea of a pristine, untouched jungle and replaces it with something more complex, a forest that was shaped, perhaps gently curated, by generations of people who knew how to live within its cycles. Alongside these geometric marvels, traces of human ingenuity can be found in the careful selection of plant species. In regions that appear wild, researchers have discovered unusually high concentrations of useful trees, like Brazil nut, cacao, and acai, growing in clusters that hint at intentional planting. These were not random coincidences of nature, but rather the quiet fingerprints of societies that enhanced their surroundings through low-impact cultivation. Their agricultural systems blended seamlessly with the forest, favoring biodiversity over domination, harmony over conquest. It is a kind of wisdom, rooted not in expansion or extraction, but in coexistence. And yet, for centuries, the prevailing belief was that the Amazon was too poor in nutrients to support large-scale agriculture or urban density. That belief was so ingrained that early reports of vast Amazonian settlements were dismissed outright. When Spanish and Portuguese explorers spoke of populous riversides and organized villages, they were assumed to be exaggerating or misinterpreting. But now, with modern technologies and a growing body of evidence, we begin to reimagine what the Amazon once was. Not just a wilderness, but a landscape of memory and quiet sophistication. Some estimates suggest that the Amazon may have supported millions of people before European contact. These were not isolated tribes scattered through the forest, but interconnected communities, part of larger networks of culture and exchange. They built roads that ran straight and true across uneven terrain. They connected waterways with causeways and canals. They had knowledge of astronomy, calendar systems, and perhaps even writing or symbolic communication, though such evidence remains elusive. Their spiritual lives were likely as rich as their ecological knowledge, with ceremonies, songs, and stories passed down under the stars, echoing through longhouses and forest clearings. Sadly, much of this vanished in the wake of disease and colonization. When European diseases spread, smallpox, influenza, measles, they decimated up to 90% of indigenous populations across the Americas. Whole communities disappeared, leaving only ghost traces behind. A ring of darker soil, a sudden break in the canopy, a mound half swallowed by roots. The forest, relentless and ever hungry, grew over it all. It is a kind of forgetting, but not complete, because the soil remembers, the trees remember, and now with each careful excavation, with each scan from the sky, we begin to remember too. Let your mind drift for a moment to one of those ancient plazas. Hear the soft hum of insects and the low murmur of a nearby river. Imagine the glow of torches lining a ritual path, the rustle of woven garments, the scent of smoked fish and ripe fruit. Somewhere in that night, a child laughs. A drum beats gently, and the forest listens. As the moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled silver on the mossy forest floor, one could imagine how long ago these same trees, or their ancestors, bore silent witness to rituals and gatherings now lost to time. The deeper we explore the concept of civilization in the Amazon, the more we come to understand that civilization does not always leave behind monuments of stone. It leaves behind systems, carefully balanced, deliberately sustained, and often invisible to the casual eye. In this part of the world, those systems were built on relationships, with the land, the rivers, the animals, and with one another. Communities may have lacked stone temples or royal palaces, but they possessed something more enduring, a profound understanding of place. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence for complex Amazonian societies lies in their hydrological engineering. Yes, even in this landscape where water is abundant, the ancient inhabitants modified their environments to manage seasonal floods, irrigate crops, and connect settlements. Raised fields, or camelones, have been found in regions like the Llanos de Moxos in Bolivia, elevated agricultural platforms separated by channels that helped regulate water levels. These raised fields stretch for miles, sometimes forming intricate patterns that can only be fully seen from above. They demonstrate not only practical knowledge of agriculture and water management, but also a kind of beauty, an artistry of earth shaped with purpose. And where there are fields, there are farmers. Families who woke each morning to the sound of birdsong and the promise of another sun-drenched day. Children who ran barefoot along muddy paths while elders tended to the fish traps and garden plots. These were lives woven into the very rhythm of the forest. Their diets were diverse and seasonal, their homes likely made from wood and palm, clustered in organized patterns around shared spaces for gathering and ceremony. Their tools, stone axes, ceramic vessels, fishing nets, were humble yet suited to their needs. But what truly set them apart was the way they understood time, not in years or kings or conquests, but in seasons, cycles, and stories passed down through generations. And perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of these ancient Amazonian societies was their ability to foster sustainability. While many civilizations throughout history exhausted the land around them through overuse or war, these forest dwellers maintained a kind of ecological balance that modern researchers are only now beginning to admire. Their creation of terra preta, dark earth enriched by charcoal and organic matter, not only improved their harvests, but also created a soil that remains fertile to this day. Some have even speculated that this innovation could help inform future agricultural practices in degraded tropical soils around the world. Imagine that, a lost knowledge from a forgotten people, offering quiet guidance to the challenges of our future. But beyond the practical, there was the spiritual. These people surely held beliefs tied to the rivers, the stars, the animals that shared their world. Shamans likely guided their communities through visions and dreams, using the plants of the forest not only as medicine, but as bridges to other realms. Ceremonies may have been held at night, with chants and dances under a canopy of stars, honoring ancestors, spirits, and the rhythms of the natural world. Though no written records remain, the forest echoes with their memory. Every path grown over with vines, every mound half buried in shadow, carries with it the silent hum of lives once lived. As the modern world races forward, building towers of glass and steel, it's easy to overlook the quiet legacies hidden in green places. But here, in the hush of the Amazon, there is a story of resilience, of balance, of a civilization that thrived not by conquering nature, but by listening to it. And as you lie here tonight, letting your breath slow and your thoughts drift like leaves upon the river, you may find comfort in that memory, that long ago, in a place far from the maps, people built a world not unlike the one we dream of today. A world of connection, of harmony, and of peace. As we drift further into the forgotten world of the Amazon Basin, we find ourselves contemplating not just the structures and systems these early societies left behind, but the subtle clues of their lives, the traces of moments that once unfolded beneath this now thick canopy. It is not difficult to imagine a morning in one of these lost villages, perhaps nestled near a river bend where the mist still clings to the water's surface. The day would begin not with alarm clocks or city noise, but with the soft calls of birds greeting the light. Fires crackled gently in hearths of earth, and the scent of roasted cassava or fish hung in the air. Women stirred pots carved from clay, children fetched water in woven baskets, and the elders sat quietly, perhaps preparing fibers or retelling old stories. In these societies, time moved differently, unmeasured by hours, but marked by the rhythms of rain, harvest, and migration. The people understood their environment with a fluency that comes only from generations of observation. They knew which plants could heal wounds, which roots brought visions, and which insects signaled the change of seasons. Their relationship with the forest was not one of domination, but of deep mutualism, and this balance extended beyond food or medicine. It shaped their worldview. Recent studies suggest that these communities had social structures that emphasized reciprocity, where wealth might have been measured in kinship ties, in shared labor, and in collective memory, rather than material goods. Their leaders may not have ruled with iron authority, but guided through wisdom, dreams, or knowledge passed down through ceremonial lineages. It is likely that rituals were central to life, connecting the living with the spirits of the ancestors and the unseen energies of the land. In sacred clearings, music echoed, simple flutes, hand drums, the cadence of voices rising in unison beneath a vault of stars. Even the forest would have joined in, with cicadas pulsing in rhythm, frogs singing in the dark, and leaves whispering above like ancient listeners. Such harmony did not mean these societies were without conflict or challenge. The forest, beautiful as it was, could be unforgiving. Seasonal floods, illness, and intertribal disputes may have shaped their choices. Yet the very fact that these communities endured for centuries speaks to their adaptability, to a deep cultural resilience. In certain areas, especially along the Purus and Madeira rivers, researchers have discovered signs of ceremonial centers, places where people may have gathered from surrounding settlements to share in rituals, trade goods, and celebrate the bonds between groups. These centers were often built with earthen mounds, causeways, and large open spaces, suggesting that communal identity held great importance. Trade, too, was vibrant. Even in the absence of roads or pack animals, the rivers acted as highways, connecting distant regions across hundreds of miles. Along these watery corridors, canoes carried not only goods, like feathers, shells, dyes, and ceramics, but also ideas, myths, and songs. This flow of exchange helped create a shared cultural fabric across what might otherwise seem an impenetrable expanse. As night returns and your thoughts begin to slow, imagine a canoe drifting silently down a moonlit tributary, the water smooth and black as obsidian, the paddler a silhouette against the stars. In the distance, a village glow flickers like a heartbeat, and the sound of a distant chant rides the breeze. This was the world of the Amazon's lost cities, not grand in stone, but profound in spirit. And though the forest has reclaimed much of what they built, it has not erased their presence entirely. Through the soil, the patterns, and the quiet persistence of memory, their legacy remains, soft, enduring, and gently waiting to be remembered. In the stillness of the rainforest, as mist curls through the undergrowth and the slow drip of water from leaf to leaf creates a gentle rhythm, one begins to grasp the patience of the forest, and the patience of those who once called it home. The civilizations of the Amazon Basin were not hurried. They evolved over centuries, quietly adapting, building, and dissolving into the very environment that sustained them. Unlike the towering ruins of Egypt or the marble columns of Greece, their presence is subtle, requiring a careful eye and even more careful listening. What we now understand as lost cities may have looked very different from what the term typically implies. Rather than dense urban centers of stone, these were networks of interconnected settlements, carefully spaced and structured, organized in concentric patterns or in rows aligned with astronomical markers. This idea, once considered speculative, has gained increasing support thanks to technologies like LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which allows researchers to see beneath the forest canopy without disturbing a single tree. With LiDAR, entire layouts of ancient communities have come into view, causeways stretching in straight lines across miles of terrain, artificial mounds arranged with geometric precision, and evidence of drainage systems that hint at sophisticated water control. It is a quiet revolution in our understanding of Amazonian history, revealing not chaos, but order, not wilderness, but design. And yet, for all this newfound clarity, questions remain. Who were the architects of these settlements? What were their languages, their stories, their dreams? Much of what we know comes from the fragments they left behind. Shards of pottery with intricate designs, stone tools worn smooth from use, and the occasional burial site, solemn and rich with meaning. Some graves suggest social stratification, with certain individuals interred with more elaborate offerings, perhaps shamans, elders, or those who held special ceremonial roles. The motifs on ceramics often depict animals, celestial bodies, or abstract symbols that may have carried spiritual or cosmological significance. These fragments, humble as they are the whispers of a culture that lived close to the rhythms of the earth, the stars, and the seasons. They point toward a worldview in which all things were connected: a tree, a river, a thunderstorm, a newborn child, all part of an unseen pattern, vast and sacred. As the forest reclaims these sites, wrapping roots around old walls and pulling structures gently back into the soil, it performs a kind of guardianship. The jungle is not merely erasing the past, it is preserving it in a form few can access, a locked library of green. Every root that twists through a foundation, every fern that shades a ceremonial mound, becomes part of the ongoing story, a living manuscript of earth and time. There's something profoundly humbling in this realization, that for all our modern tools, there are stories we can only partially read, echoes we can only faintly hear. And so we return to the present, drifting between the visible and the invisible, between knowledge and wonder. As you lie here now, letting your mind sink into the hush of night, imagine standing on a small rise in the middle of the Amazon, surrounded by trees so tall they seem to touch the sky. The air is warm and still, filled with the quiet breathing of 1,000 unseen creatures. Beneath your feet lies the buried trace of a plaza, once filled with people, voices, songs, laughter, the crackle of fire, the murmur of stories told by elders who had heard them told as children. None of them knew they were building something that would one day be called lost. They were simply living, honoring the forest, their ancestors, and the mysterious beauty of life itself. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Amazon's forgotten cities, not in what they built, but in how they lived, gently, thoughtfully, in harmony with the world that held them. As we move ever more gently through the veils of time and forest, we come to understand that the true legacy of the Amazon Basin is not one of dramatic collapse or grand conquests, but of endurance, quiet, patient endurance etched into the very soil. Unlike the ruins of Rome or the pyramids of Mesoamerica, the lost cities of the Amazon were not built to defy the ages with permanence in stone. Instead, they were woven into the living world, meant to breathe with the trees, flood with the rivers, and fade with the seasons. It was a legacy of impermanence that paradoxically preserved them, because their ruins were not mined or pillaged by empires, but slowly hidden, gently swallowed by time's green embrace. One of the most intriguing aspects that continues to captivate researchers and storytellers alike is the concept of dark earth, or terra preta, which is found in patches across the Amazon and remains a puzzle not only of science, but of cultural legacy. These patches of deep, rich soil are artificial, created intentionally through a blend of charcoal, bone, compost, and organic waste. Their existence signals more than agricultural ingenuity. It points to a long-term vision of stewardship. Unlike most tropical soils, which are easily depleted, terra preta remains fertile for centuries. It holds moisture, nurtures microbial life, and retains nutrients in a way that modern agronomists still find difficult to replicate. This is not simply a matter of better crops. It's a glimpse into a worldview that treated the earth not as a resource to be extracted, but as a partner to be nourished. And so the people who lived in these now lost cities were not only builders and farmers, but caretakers, creators of a sustainable legacy that outlasted their names. Imagine now the daily work of tending to such a world, young hands mixing ash and food scraps into the ground, elders teaching through action rather than words. Every gesture imbued with intention. These were acts of resilience disguised as routine, of hope disguised as habit. And if Terra Preta tells a story of thoughtful agriculture, then the geometric earthworks, found in places like Acre and Mato Grosso, tell a story of shared vision and design. Circles, squares, and connecting causeways, cut with remarkable precision across the forest floor, suggest a level of planning and symbolism far beyond what was once assumed possible. Were these defensive structures, ceremonial grounds, calendrical observatories aligned to the solstice? The answers remain partial, but the presence of symmetry, scale, and alignment suggests these spaces were more than practical. They were meaningful. They may have encoded myths, tracked celestial patterns, or served as sacred thresholds between the human and the divine. As the night deepens and your thoughts become lighter, picture walking along one of these ancient ditches, now softened by centuries of leaves and silence. The walls are barely visible in the moonlight, but the curve is unmistakable, as if drawn by the hand of something thoughtful and old. Fireflies blink like forgotten stars. Somewhere nearby, a river murmurs the same song it has sung since those first footsteps padded along its edge. The people who lived here did not think of themselves as mysterious or ancient. They were simply living their lives, rooted in cycles they understood deeply. There is something comforting in that simplicity. No drama, no collapse, just life, quietly and richly lived. And when they were gone, they left not chaos, but echoes. Dark soil, sleeping shapes beneath the trees, and a forest that remembers. As we close this chapter of their story tonight, may your own breath slow into rhythm with theirs. May your rest be deep, like the rivers they loved, and your dreams stretch wide, like the canopy that once covered their world. As the quiet layers of rainforest history unfold before us, it becomes clearer that what we often consider lost was never truly gone, only overlooked. Gently veiled by vines and silence, protected more than forgotten. The Amazon Basin, stretching endlessly with its green rivers and tangled light, was home not just to a few isolated communities, but to a broad network of interconnected peoples, each shaping the landscape in subtle ways. The sheer scale of these cultures, measured not in the number of stone monuments they left behind, but in the spread of shared practices, regional adaptations, and environmental harmony, is only now beginning to be understood. It's possible that over 5 million people once lived within this forest before European contact, forming a kind of rainforest civilization that defies conventional expectations. These people did not seek to conquer the wild. Instead, they made it livable, navigable, abundant. Their villages were connected by rivers and footpaths, their boundaries fluid, their survival tied to mutual respect between neighboring groups. Oral tradition, rather than writing, carried knowledge, complex systems of memory embedded in ritual, myth, and song. The forest itself may have been their library, each tree a page, each bird call a whisper of cultural code. And yet, in the centuries that followed colonization, disease, and forced migration, many of these connections were severed. The people who remembered the old places were silenced, or moved, or simply lost their audience. What remains today is not silence, but the soft echo of stories trying to return. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and even satellite analysts now collaborate to piece together this forgotten web of life. One researcher might trace a buried road that curves too perfectly to be natural. Another might find unusually clustered plant species that suggest ancient domestication zones, groves of Brazil nuts, peach palms, and cacao trees that do not grow together by accident. These botanical clues suggest deliberate planting patterns, even agroforestry systems designed to feed entire regions. Such forests, cultivated through centuries of care, are known as cultural forests, landscapes that blur the line between nature and nurture. They are proof that the forest as we see it today is not entirely wild, but a living mosaic of ancient choices. In this view, the Amazon is not merely a jungle to be explored. but a cathedral of memory, each layer a layer of intention. The architecture of these lost cities, then, is not vertical but horizontal, not built up in towers but spread wide across space and time. Earthworks, dark soils, aligned pathways, planted forests, these are the foundations, walls, and rooftops of a civilization that chose invisibility as its legacy. And now, centuries later, as you lie in the stillness of your own room, you are brushing against that legacy, gently and quietly. Imagine now walking along a narrow trail beneath towering cebus and kapoks, your footsteps hushed by layers of fallen leaves. Perhaps you reach a clearing where the light filters just right, and the air feels thicker, like the place remembers something you do not. You kneel, touch the soil, and feel its softness, terra preta, warm and ancient. Somewhere in the trees, a toucan calls. A breeze shifts the branches above. You do not speak, because this is not a place for noise. It is a place for listening. And as the night wraps around your thoughts, remember that you are not so far from these lost cities. Their stories are still here, beneath your dreams, beneath the green, beneath the stars. What they left was not ruins, but rhythms. And even now, centuries later, if you listen closely enough, you may still hear them. In the dense hush of the Amazonian twilight, as the sun retreats beneath the green canopy and the sounds of the forest begin their nocturnal rhythm, we turn now to the final layers of this forgotten civilization's story. Layers not made of clay or bone, but of memory and mystery. Among the more haunting and beautiful theories surrounding the lost cities of the Amazon is the idea that they never truly vanished, but instead were woven so seamlessly into the landscape that their survival was mistaken for disappearance. When early explorers, driven by dreams of golden cities and stone temples, ventured deep into the rainforest, they found only silence where they expected splendor. But perhaps they had asked the wrong questions. The cities were not built to last in marble, but to breathe with the jungle, and so their absence was a form of survival. The people had lived lightly, but not insignificantly. Their knowledge of medicinal plants, for example, passed down in quiet rituals and careful observation, remains among the most advanced on Earth. Shamans and healers could navigate symptoms with astonishing precision, diagnosing conditions not with instruments, but with instinct and generations of experience. And the forest, in return, gave generously, leaves to cool fevers, roots to ease pain, tree sap that sealed wounds like a bandage made from light. This balance between giving and receiving, knowing and not needing to explain, was at the heart of their way of life. And so as the Western world moved toward cities of steel and glass, carving straight lines through chaos, the people of the Amazon had long lived by another geometry, one curved like rivers, soft like moss, slow like growth. Even now, traces of their language linger in place names, in whispered prayers, in the way old stories are told under dirt, under the stars. Some believe the forest itself remembers, that its rhythms carry the hum of songs long gone. Others look to the skies, wondering if the very constellations that guided planting and harvest still shine with meaning. From time to time, a community elder in a remote village may point to a tree and tell a tale of a time when their ancestors walked between towns that no longer appear on maps, when festivals lit the night with color and drums echoed down dirt paths. It is not a history of empires, but of continuity, of people who learn to live with rather than over the land. The Amazon, in this light, becomes not a place of decay, but of quiet preservation. And as we come near the end of the story, you may feel a kind of peace settle over you, not because everything has been explained, but because mystery itself can be restful. Some stories are meant not to be solved, but to be carried like a small flame, warming the quiet corners of your thoughts. As you lie here now, breathing with the slow rhythm of the forest beyond your window, you are not just listening to history. You are listening to echoes, to memories, to lives that touched the earth gently and left no scars. Perhaps that is the deepest legacy of the lost cities, not what they built, but what they chose to leave unbroken. And in that silence, in that humility, we find a kind of wisdom too vast for words. Let it wrap around you now, like mist among the trees, as sleep begins to gather you softly into its arms. As we draw further into the quiet of night and deeper into the heart of the Amazon's legacy, our thoughts begin to settle not just on what was found, but on what was never lost. intangible things like resilience, intuition, harmony. The civilizations of the Amazon Basin may not have carved grand temples into cliffs or raised ziggurats to the sky, but they built instead in rhythms, in seasons, in stars, in songs passed from mother to daughter, elder to child. These people, scattered across an enormous expanse of river and forest, developed sophisticated systems of governance, trade, and diplomacy, without the need for centralized empires. Power in these lost cities was not measured in armies, but in trust. Many settlements were organized in loose federations or alliances, bound not by force, but by mutual benefit and shared stewardship of the land. Far from the myth of primitive isolation, these communities exchanged goods across great distances: ceramics, feathers, dyes, and cultivated seeds, all moving like whispers along the forest's arteries. Canoes carved from ancient trees slipped along muddy rivers, carrying not just trade, but stories, ideas, and laughter. There was a humility to their movement, a grace in their navigation of both water and relationship. Even conflict, when it arose, often resolved through ritual or negotiation, reveals a worldview centered not on conquest, but on continuation. Their technologies, too, were suited to their world, not built to dominate, but to blend. Raised fields designed to resist floods, aquaculture systems that balanced fish populations naturally, and architecture that allowed breeze and shade to coexist. A village might appear modest, even invisible from above, but functioned like an ecosystem within an ecosystem. Houses built of thatch and wood were often dismantled and rebuilt seasonally, echoing the forest's own impermanence. And this impermanence was not seen as a weakness, but a wisdom. They did not fear disappearance because they had learned to trust in renewal. That is why, perhaps, so little of their material world remains. Their cities were never meant to defy nature, but to participate in it. And still, in the folds of the forest, the shapes linger. Geoglyphs, seen only from the air, speak to a different kind of permanence, one written not in stone, but in space. These massive earthworks, symmetrical and carefully placed, suggest a deep engagement with both land and sky. Perhaps they mark the turning of seasons, the memory of ancestors, or the presence of the sacred. We may never know their full meaning, but their existence tells us something profound, that people once stood where we now fly, and saw with eyes not so different from ours. They looked up at the stars and wondered. They looked down at the earth and shaped it with reverence. And in the in-between, the silence between bird calls, the pause between paddle strokes, they lived. Tonight, as you rest, let your thoughts drift like those canoes, gently carried on the current of time. Let the mystery soothe rather than disturb. For in every question the forest holds, there is also an answer, not spoken, but felt. And if you are very quiet, you might hear it now, wrapped in leaves and memory, calling softly through the night. And now, as the final echoes of our story drift into the quiet night, we come to rest in the gentle realization that the lost cities of the Amazon were never monuments of grandeur, but mosaics of memory, woven through water, soil, and silence. These were not cities built to challenge time, but to travel alongside it. They did not rise in defiance of nature, but folded into it like leaves into the forest floor, like stars into the canopy of a cloudless sky. Their endurance lies not in walls that remain, but in patterns that persist. In the dark, fertile earth still tilled by modern hands, in the subtle symmetry of ancient ditches visible only from the sky, in the trees planted with purpose that now grow as if wild. For generations, these people observed the cycles of rain and drought, the paths of the sun and moon, and created from those patterns a way of life that required no stone towers to prove its brilliance. Their architecture was the flow of rivers, their archives were seeds and songs, and their cathedrals were the shaded clearings where story met ceremony. And though the world forgot them for centuries, the forest remembered. It held their legacies in roots and ruins, in canopy and current, waiting for us to look again, not with the eyes of conquerors or treasure seekers, but with the curiosity of quiet minds. Today, as researchers uncover earthworks beneath thick vegetation and local communities preserve rituals once dismissed as myth, we begin to understand that we have always been walking across maps we failed to read. With each layer of satellite imagery, each unearthed shard of pottery, we are not discovering a lost world, we are remembering it. And in that remembering, we are offered something rare, the chance to see civilization not as domination, but as deep relationship. The peoples of the Amazon did not seek to control their world, but to converse with it. Their survival depended not on innovation alone, but on attunement, on listening more than changing, on harmonizing more than conquering. As the wind moves gently through leaves even now, one might imagine it still carries the hum of ancient languages, the laughter of distant ancestors, the prayers of those who saw the forest not as wilderness, but as home. And what a home it was, ever shifting, ever sustaining, a living museum of presence and patience. Tonight, as you lie still and the rhythm of your breathing slows to match the quiet around you, let this story become a soft place to rest. Not every history needs to end in certainty. Some are meant to dissolve slowly, like mist across a morning river, or like memory fading into dream. What matters is not what we can measure, but what we can feel. The whisper of something wise that does not need to speak loudly. Perhaps, then, the lost cities were never truly lost. They are here still, in the quiet logic of the jungle, in the warmth of the earth, in the silence that cradles you now. Let that silence carry you gently into sleep, into stillness, into the forgotten spaces where stories rest, until they are ready to be heard again. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I hope this quiet journey through time brought you a gentle sense of peace and comfort. May your sleep tonight be deep, and your dreams be calm and kind. And when you wake, may your day begin with clarity, joy, and a heart that feels just a little bit lighter. If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving a like and subscribing so we can continue walking through forgotten history together. Until next time, good night, and see you in the next story.